Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the FDIC. We haven't seen you all for a while, so it's nice to be together. I actually checked the calendar. It's the last time this committee met virtually was in October of 2020. And the last time this committee met in person, hard to believe, was December of 2018. So it's been 4 years since we've actually seen you all. And we are going to do our best not to let another 4 years pass without seeing you again. And we're going to try to resume annual meetings of this committee, which really has enormous value to us in an area that is of vital importance to the FDIC. At the end of the day, our ability to manage the orderly failure of a systemic financial institution will probably be the ultimate credibility test for our agency, and how our agency is viewed will be determined by how we handle that challenge, and our preparations to carry out that responsibility are absolutely central to what we do. So, and our ability to meet with you on a regular basis to share with you the work we're doing and to get your input really has enormous value to us. So we thank you for being here. And I'm sorry, it's a large committee. It may get larger, so we're a little bit cramped, but I hope you bear with us. We wanted to take advantage of it. Let me begin by introducing some of the new members who have joined us. Tim Clark, who is the Distinguished Senior Banking Advisor at Better Markets, and some of you may know him as the former Deputy Director of Supervision and Regulation at the Federal Reserve. Tim was definitely a partner in crime with us. It was really our partnership with Tim and the Fed that allowed us to make the Title I resolution plans into meaningful tools for us to use to enhance the resolvability of our largest, most systemic global financial institution. So the fact that we were able to entice Tim to join this committee was a big plus for us. And let me also introduce Frank LaSala, the President and CEO of the Depository Trust Clearing Corporation, DTCC, one of our top priorities at the FDIC, and it's an international priority as well, is making progress on the resolution of central clearing counterparties. They, in some ways, define what systemic risk is. And in all the areas in post-crisis resolution, I think it's arguable that we've made the least progress in regard to CCP resolution. So that is a top priority for us here at the FDIC, and domestically here in the United States. And it's a major priority internationally for the Financial Stability Board, and we're going to have a discussion around that later this morning. In addition, we've been joined by several other distinguished new members. This will be their first meeting. Jay Clayton, the former chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Margaret Tayar, a partner and co-head of financial institutions at Davis Polk. And Wilson Irvin, a former vice chairman at Credit Suisse, who played a formative role in helping define thinking around the issue of systemic resolution. And if I may introduce a special guest who's joining us this morning, Elke Koenig, who many of you may know. She is the chair of the Single Resolution Board for Europe. Elke is the founding chair of the Single Resolution Board. There was no resolution authority in Europe before Elke, and there is now a viable, robust institution, really the first institution of its kind in the European community with a capacity for resolving large financial institutions. Elke is finishing her second term as chair next month, and she'll be required to step down. That's the limit of her service, and she's graciously agreed to join this committee after she steps down as chair of the SRB, and she'll be an invaluable addition to us. And let me recognize, if I may, 4 former members who have whose terms expired and have left the committee. Bill Donaldson, former chair of the SEC; Peter Fisher, former undersecretary of the Treasury and now a senior fellow at the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth; Gary Stern, former president and CEO of the Minneapolis Fed; and Michael Bodson, president and CEO of DTCC, who's now, and we now have the benefit of his successor serving on the committee. We have a full agenda, so I'm not going to take more time, but we've really broken the morning into 3 sessions that I think will be of interest to you. The first session is going to focus on our efforts to integrate our supervision and resolution responsibilities. I think one of the strengths of the FDIC is we have, in one institution, responsibility for resolution, a significant part of supervisory responsibility in the U.S. banking system, as well as the deposit insurance responsibility. Tremendous synergies among those 3 functions, and the importance of close collaboration and integration between supervision and resolution is really fundamental to an effective resolution process. We want to talk about our work from that perspective. In the second session, we're going to focus on our 2 key resolution priorities: our ongoing work for systemic resolution under Title II of the Dodd-Frank Act and our utilization of the Orderly Liquidation Authority. And we're going to focus in particular on our work around increasing transparency and how we think about Title II resolution and communicating with financial markets as well as the public to try to establish better understanding of what we do. And that is really not a simple task, as you all probably understand better than most. So we want to talk about that issue. And then also what is a key priority for us, which is enhancing our ability to manage the failure of large banking organizations below the GSIB level. It's really a very distinct resolution challenge for us from the GSIBs, in many ways as great as the GSIB challenge. And because we were so obsessed with developing a capability to manage the failure of GSIBs, that was not the first thing we turned to was not the large banks. And then we woke up and realized the failure of one of these large banking institutions could really be an enormous challenge with financial stability implications. So we've devoted a lot of time. That's a priority, I think, for all 3 of the U.S. banking agencies, the Fed and the OCC, as well as the FDIC. And as you may know, the FDIC and the Fed issued a joint advance notice of proposed rulemaking to seek public comment on the possibility of establishing a long-term debt requirement for our largest banking organizations below the GSIB level to facilitate a capacity for orderly failure. So we'll talk about all of that work. And then finally, we're going to have a session on the issue I mentioned previously, the challenges relating to the resolution of a central counterparty. Central counterparties, as you all well know, were of systemic consequence before the 2008 crisis. And then as a result of one of the key reforms after the crisis of mandating clearing for derivatives, if anything, we expanded the systemic footprint of CCPs. And it's not clear that the resolution capacities here in the United States or internationally really evolved to deal with the enhanced systemic risk that a failure of a CCP could present. So we've been spending a lot of time on that here at the FDIC. It's a big priority and focus of attention internationally within the Financial Stability Board and within other jurisdictions. So we're going to continue that discussion here, and we have a special guest joining us virtually, whom some of you may know, Sir John Cunliffe, who's the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England for Financial Stability, and John is also chairing the Committee on Payments and Market Infrastructure of the BIS. He's been focused on payments issues internationally, and in particular, the supervision and resolution of CCPs. He's really been an international leader on this issue, and we thought we could benefit from a conversation with John. So that's our program for this morning. Thank you all for being here. We have the privilege of being joined by our other board members, Acting Controller Mike Sue, and Director of our Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. It's still early in the morning, I got to tell you. Rohit Chopra. Mike, would you have any comment?
Just to say, it's great to be here, to see a lot of familiar faces, to meet some new folks. These issues are very near and dear to my heart, so I just look forward to jumping right in. Thank you.
In his previous life, Mike was also a partner in crime with Tim Clark over at the Fed.
Partner in compliance.
Partner in compliance.
Thank you for that clarification.
Well, let me just thank all of you for being here, and I want to echo, it's good to be with people in person again. The staff has prepared a lot to make sure that they can solicit feedback from all of you. I'm just going to echo a couple things that the acting chairman discussed that are issues of concern for the board, for me, for others. And as Marty mentioned, obviously the failure of a domestic, systemically important financial institution would be quite challenging. The FDIC has some good experiences, bad experiences, and learning from this. And I think it's no surprise that a CFPB director is worried about the failure of an institution with an enormous footprint in consumer and retail banking, a very large number of accounts, and the regional impact or national impact of its failure. And I think as he mentioned, there has been a proposal, an ANPR by the FDIC and the Fed about ways to prevent that and remove from the playbook of simply selling it to a GSIB. I'll also add, a couple of other points of concern for me. One is obviously the undesignated non-bank systemically important financial institutions. The Financial Stability Oversight Council has not designated any in quite some time. And I think many experts agree they exist, and we do not have resolution plans for them. That would make resolution very challenging and create an enormous amount of complexity. And of course, the work that the acting chairman has mentioned about the GSIBs. There's no victory to be declared. There are still a number of complexities. And of course, U.S. law requires us to evaluate those resolution plans based on whether they can be credibly completed in a Chapter 11 bankruptcy, which I think many of us know is a fairy tale right now. So there's so much work I think we need to do. The markets have obviously changed quite a bit since the last time you met together. So really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Rohit. Let me turn the program over to John Keneally, the Director of the FDIC's Division of Complex Institution Supervision and Resolution. John.
Thank you, Chairman Gruberg. Good morning, and thank you all for joining us today. I am John Keneally, the Director, as Marty said, of the Division of Complex Institution Supervision and Resolution, although it's much easier to say CISR, so we'll stick with that. I'm joined at the table by the panelists for our first session, Senior Deputy Director Jim McGraw, Deputy Directors Andy Felton and Alfred Seibold, and our legal counsel, David Wall. Before we get started, I just unfortunately need to take care of a couple of administrative matters. First, our legal staff has asked that I provide two statements for today's meeting. The first is a statement regarding the Sunshine Act. So I'll read that. We have all members of the FDIC Board of Directors in attendance today as we begin the advisory committee meeting. The government in the Sunshine Act imposes notice and access requirements whenever a quorum of the FDIC's Board of Directors meets to conduct or determine agency business. This meeting is not held for such purposes and does not constitute a meeting under the Act. The board members present will only engage in general or preliminary discussions that do not relate to specific proposals for action pending before the FDIC. Any specific issues for official board resolution remain open for full consideration by the board following the conclusion of the meeting. The second statement, regards the advance notice of proposed rulemaking, or ANPR, which was mentioned. concerning potential new resolution-related resource requirements for large banking organizations, which was approved by the FDIC Board of Directors on October 18th, 2022, and also approved by the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System and is currently open for comment. Staff will not respond substantively to any comments on the ANPR and generally will be in listening mode and not indicate the direction the agencies are likely to take with respect to an NPR or final rule. In addition, per our regular practice, the FDIC will publish a summary of this meeting relating to the ANPR on our public website. The summary will generally include a list of participants and a high-level summary of the discussion. And if you have questions on either of those statements, we have our FDIC legal staff who would be happy to answer them. So, just a couple of technical notes. If you'd like to speak, you have just press the green lights on your microphone, or for those who will be participating remotely, you can use the WebEx raise hand function, but there's really no need to be so formal. And in the meeting, please jump into the discussion at any time. I'm sure people are not shy here. So I'd also like to remind participants that the meeting is public and is being live streamed. So I appreciate the opportunity to provide a few introductory comments today. And today we'd like to provide the committee with an update on work being done with respect to systemic resolution, along with some of the challenges that we continue to face. And we look forward to the committee's input to help further our work on these matters. So let me just take a minute to set the stage for today, particularly for new members. As you know, following the 2008 financial crisis, Congress established new authorities for the FDIC to manage the orderly resolution of large, complex financial institutions whose failure could threaten U.S. financial stability, most notably Titles I and II of the Dodd-Frank Act. Shortly thereafter, in June 2011, then FDIC Chairman Sheila Bair convened the first meeting of this committee, noting that the knowledge and expertise brought to bear by members of the committee would greatly enhance the corporation's efforts to develop and implement these tools. In the 7 meetings held since then, a wide range of systemic resolution issues have been brought to the committee in order to test thinking and solicit your feedback. The first meetings obviously focused on core aspects of systemic resolution, including the establishment of the Orderly Liquidation Authority and the development of the foundational single point of entry strategy. Subsequent meetings discussed various structural reforms to operationalize the SPOE strategy, such as long-term debt requirements for long-term debt, clean holding companies, orderly transfer of QFCs. And more recently, the committee has discussed our work on cross-border engagement, bankruptcy challenges, Title I reviews, capabilities testing, which we'll hear a little bit about today, brokers, dealers, and other developments. And thanks to the input from you all on these issues, the FDIC has really made significant strides in systemic resolution planning. Yet challenges remain, which brings us to the agenda for today. And I know Chairman Gruberg went through some of the agenda. I just want to elaborate on a couple of points, and I'll just walk through. And on slide 4, we have the agenda. The first session really will be just a brief update by our risk staff on recent work in CISR to integrate our supervisory and resolution responsibilities. I'm sure many of you remember during the financial crisis, the coordination challenges that we faced between the agencies, between supervision and resolution, and a lot of work has been done since then to bridge these gaps. And we look forward to your thoughts on the directions we're taking here in CISR in that regard. So as Jim and Andy and Alfred go through their presentations, we'd like you to think about your experiences and the challenges you faced and share them and maybe identify ways that we could do this better. The second session, which is really the heart of the meeting today, our resolution staff will discuss 2 topics: GSIB resolution planning under Title II and the need for public transparency, and the challenges and options for resolving non-GSIB large banks. Here, and as the chairman mentioned, we'll introduce and discuss the topic of transparency. The FDIC has a long record of fostering public confidence. Everybody knows if you walk into the bank and see that FDIC sign, your deposits are safe. And we really want to build on that level of confidence around the execution of our Title II authorities. In essence, what we're looking for from you is who needs to know what and when about our efforts to help build our public credibility and confidence. The second topic, the resolution of large banks that are not GSIBs, is really new for consideration by the committee. In this session, we'll seek your input about the work we're doing and the challenges this work presents, which are formidable, whether it's for the FDIC or the financial system. And in the third session, as mentioned, we returned to a topic that we briefly discussed with the committee in 2020, which is the challenge of resolution of CCPs. This topic is one that is on a lot of policymakers' minds globally, and a lot of work is being done and warrants continued consideration by the committee. And we look forward to hearing from our guest speaker, Sir John Cunliffe, and from you all on how we should go about being prepared and prioritize these challenges that we have. Okay. Are there any questions on the agenda before I move on? Okay. So then as a kickoff to our first session, let me just, which is on the integration of supervision resolution, let me just take a couple of minutes to reintroduce CISR, which is the division primarily responsible for executing the FDIC's supervision and resolution responsibilities for the largest and most complex financial institutions. You'll see on slide 3 the mission of CISR, and it's pretty straightforward: to protect and maintain stability in the U.S. financial system by avoiding and, if necessary, managing the failure of a large, complex financial institution. So this mission statement clearly sets out our focus on the use of both supervisory and resolution authorities to address financial stability. And the focus and approach really has been driven by the evolution of the banking industry. The growth over the past 35 years in the actual and relative size and the resultant complexity of the nation's largest banks, along with the broadened systemic resolution powers that have been provided under Dodd-Frank, really has caused the FDIC over time to adopt new and more sophisticated approaches to its supervision, resolution, and insurance functions. The changes were naturally incremental, and over time, the FDIC had specialized staff working on very similar issues throughout the organization. There were a lot of challenges in coordination, and supervisors don't like to talk a lot about failure, and resolution specialists like to talk about nothing but failure. So we had a bridge that we needed to cross and bring together. So an important part of this evolution was the creation in 2019 of CISR, really to consolidate all those resources and adopt a more integrated approach that leverages both our supervisory and resolution responsibilities. As the need to plan for the resolution of these institutions starts long before the stresses begin, we have to start well into BAU. So CISR works proactively early on to fully understand the firm's unique characteristics and activities, the degree of complexity, their resiliency, very important on the resiliency, the level of risk, and their potential impact on financial stability. And to accomplish this, we build cross-disciplinary teams that integrate professionals throughout the division: resolution, supervision, lawyers, economists, pretty much anything you can think of. And we work also closely with our other divisions and our sister agencies, and we've done a lot of good work with the OCC and the Fed on this topic. We also engage in active cross-border coordination through the work of our supervisory colleges and crisis management groups, which really are now part of our BAU activities to build and maintain our readiness. And we have both the supervisory colleges and the crisis management groups, which are looking at the same institutions from two different perspectives, and we look at them with staff from both sides. So in taking this approach, we're hoping to achieve several overarching objectives. One is to improve our coordination, our consistency, and our accountability. Secondly is to foster a collaborative and interdisciplinary approach to these issues. And third, and really most importantly, we want to ensure that information, resources, and expertise are shared in advance and readily available in the event of a crisis situation. So with that, I will I'll just stop for a moment if anybody has any questions before I move on. Okay, great. So then I will turn it over to Jim McGraw. He will expand on our efforts to better integrate supervision and resolution. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So good morning and welcome to the advisory committee members and the guests here in the room and those who are joining us online. My name is Jim McGraw. I'm the Senior Deputy Director of the FDIC's Division of Complex Institution Supervision and Resolution, or as I'll refer to it going forward, as John said, CISR. So this morning I'm going to briefly discuss the unique organizational structure within CISR, where we have brought together within one division the supervision or risk expertise and the resolution expertise. You know, the communication, the collaboration, the cooperation, sharing of information, sharing of expertise between supervision and resolution within CISR really is one of the fundamental benefits of having both disciplines in one division. So within CSR, we have 3 business line branches. We have institution risk, systemic risk, and resolution readiness. We also have the 4th branch, the operations branch, which supports the other 3 business line branches. Institutional risk provides our firm-specific on-site supervisory work, focusing in on key risk, vulnerabilities, resiliency, you know, the adequacy of risk management practices within the firm. Systemic risk is focused on systemic and emerging risks within our portfolio of firms, and looking at it more horizontally across the firms, and then also looking at those risks within the financial industry itself. There are also systemic risk is responsible for supporting our supervisory programs, for developing and monitoring policy, developing our quantitative analytical tools. There's a lot of information that comes in, a lot of data from these firms, and there's a lot of analytical tools that we build out to help us in both our risk and our resolution work. And they also oversee our international coordination, which I'll talk about in a little more detail in a few minutes. And then we've got the resolution readiness branch, which formulates and in the event of a failure would be responsible for leading the execution of a strategy to resolve a large complex financial institution, either under the FDI Act or Title II of the Dodd-Frank Act. The flow of information and analysis between these branches is critical. You know, knowing where the key risks and vulnerabilities and risk management weaknesses exist within, you know, specific business lines, material entities, critical services, critical operations, where those are located within the firm, understanding the interconnectedness within the firm, ultimately understanding where a firm stands on the crisis continuum from a risk perspective is critical in determining where resolution readiness resources need to be focused. And also knowing the information needs on the resolution readiness side helps inform our supervision side when they're prioritizing and developing their supervisory plans. Between the risk and readiness branches, we have, you know, regular structured discussions. We have ad hoc discussions. We have information sharing programs. We have an interdivisional committee made up of executive managers from all 3 branches that meets to, you know, oversee and ensure that we have appropriate supervisory and resolution strategies in place that complement each other. Within CISR, we have an escalation protocol process, which is a collaborative process between risk and readiness, where firms are evaluated and placed into priority focus buckets, you know, based on risk profile, perceived probability of default, and then that is able to serve as a guide as we develop steps that can be taken to better prepare for a potential resolution event. I mentioned the international coordination within the systemic risk branch. You know, the crisis management groups John mentioned, CMGs, are a significant part of that coordination. You know, they exist to facilitate cross-border cooperation among both supervisory and resolution authorities, you know, representing home and host jurisdictions for the systemically important financial institutions. We have firm-specific information sharing and cooperation arrangements that support this cross-border crisis planning activity. And then the members maintain regular dialogue. We have, you know, formal, generally on an annual basis, meetings where, you know, we build and maintain relationships between the different authorities, exchanging information relevant to resolution planning to, you know, to ensure that we have a rapid resolution response in a time of stress. I also mentioned that the CMGs have really enhanced our internal CISR coordination between all the branches. As you know, over the last couple of years, all of the disciplines, risk and supervision, have worked together in planning and preparing for these CMG meetings. And, you know, bringing the on-site supervisory perspective into these meetings has really enhanced their effectiveness from a resolution planning standpoint. Cyber risk, I'm just going to mention this quick. You know, it's just an example of a risk where, you know, the coordination and communication between supervision and resolution is key. You know, understanding where cyber risk vulnerabilities are within the firm, within the business lines, material entities, how it could impact different critical services, critical operations is key when assessing and planning for resolution risk. Slide 7. I'll mention for Title I planning, again, the presence of our on-site supervisory staff monitoring the condition and the risk management of large, complex financial institutions, the knowledge gained through examination participation and our offsite analysis, it's a valuable resource that we have to leverage as part of the Title I plan review process. On-site supervisory staff have access to, specific information that can supplement the information that the firms provide in their Title I plans and should be incorporated into our overall plan assessment. Information learned through supervisory programs, can be critical in understanding a firm's Title I capabilities, which in turn informs us from a Title II perspective as well. Supervisory programs should be used to, help us to test assumptions and capabilities and assertions that firms put within their Title I plans. I'll point out, the drafters of the original 165D rule actually recognize the value of incorporating supervisory programs into Title I plan review, where it states in the rule that the board and the corporation will rely to the fullest extent possible on examinations conducted by or on behalf of the appropriate federal banking agency for the relevant company. Related to recovery plans, CISR staff from both resolution readiness and risk have been working closely with the other banking agencies to plan for and participate in in-depth reviews of recovery plans submitted by firms subject to the OCC's recovery plan rule. And again, this work has considerable overlap with Title I and Title II. Finally, I do want to note, and this has already been mentioned by Chairman Grunberg and by John, but my comments up to this point have focused on banks and bank holding companies where we have the supervisory insight and the Title I work that we're able to use that to support a robust resolution preparation for those institutions. However, we also have responsibility for resolving non-bank financial companies if their failure threatens U.S. financial stability, and the work associated with the non-bank financial companies is more difficult, given we don't have nearly the same resolution tools or resolution engagement and insight with those firms. A common challenge that we discussed with you back in 2020 was the fact that the FDIC didn't have access to certain data that would be needed in the run-up to or during a resolution event for one of these companies. Another more specific challenge, which Jenny Trayley will talk about later this morning, is the fact that the non-bank financial companies are not required to submit Title I resolution plans. And as we've mentioned, Title I plans provide the FDIC with direct access to key information that would be useful in supporting a Title II resolution. So to address those impediments to non-bank financial company resolution planning, we do work closely with the other regulatory agencies, both domestically and internationally, to help sharpen our understanding of what the FDIC might need to undertake a successful resolution of one of these firms. We've also put in place data sharing arrangements for the FDIC to receive material, non-public information from the firm's supervisors. But I will say, even with the best efforts, it's still difficult to address the root challenges that we face in thinking about a Title II resolution of a non-bank financial company. And again, we've devoted a whole segment on the agenda to CCPs later this morning, where I'm sure we'll have a very robust discussion on that topic. So with that, I'll stop and just open up if anyone has any questions or comments. Yes, John.
Jim, impressive how you're coordinating all of this yourselves. What about the interaction with the institutions themselves? Obviously, supervision can be pretty formal. Do you have informal sort of interactions with the targeted companies themselves that would allow you to flesh out some of your work and their sort of response to it? Because to some extent, you're part of their immune system.
Yeah. I mean, on the supervisory side, we have direct daily contact with our on-site presence. Through the CMGs, we have, access and discuss these, the resolution topics with the firms on during those meetings. And then during the recovery plan review work, we'll have discussions with the firms there. On Title I, we have discussions with the firms. So we are able to build into a lot of our interaction with the firms, the resolution issues and concerns that we might have.
So there isn't a barrier that's making your job hard.
I would say that the whole purpose behind the formation of CISR was to break down that barrier And I think we've done a good job getting that in place. You know, there's still more work to be done, but I think, you know, the integration of the supervision and resolution is much stronger now than prior to the formation of CISR.
Question that goes back to something that John mentioned. I used to run a credit department in a former life, and one of the tensions was how to deal with the credit officers who thought their credit was good and would sometimes fall in love with it as it's going down to a difficult path. And how do you discover that dance of when to turn it over to recovery? You don't want to move too early, but you also don't want to be too late. So as you've integrated these two teams, how do you deal with that issue to make sure that people don't fall in love and think of this as a black mark? If I turn it over to resolution, I failed as a supervisor.
I think that's a really good question, and I would say, and others can chime in too. I would say that the formation of CISR, we've tried to, you know, that's been one of the purposes of that, is to bring them together where we're not thinking of this as, okay, this all belongs to supervision, and now we got to turn it over to resolution. That we're all one team working on this together. And, you know, the development, when I mentioned the escalation protocols, that's work that's done collaboratively between supervision and resolution, where we're looking at firms and we're discussing the risk profile of the firm. How well is the risk being managed? What is, you know, a perceived probability of default on that firm? And you know, we have a lot of really honest, frank discussions in those committee meetings as far as, you know, where should firms be placed within these priority risk buckets? And so I would say our conversations on a daily basis are integrating both supervision and resolution. We've hopefully done a good job getting rid of, you know, it belongs to the supervisory side until everything's, you know, already hit the fan, and now we're heading it over to resolution.
Yeah, I'll just add that really is an excellent question, and there is a lot of tension, and you know, there's even tension on the supervisory side. You always want to make sure examiners are objective and independent, and that's a struggle sometimes if they're at the institution a lot. But I think it's one of the things that I see, for example, that is really heartening is we have supervisory staff on site that will, you know, be monitoring the institution and see something that they're doing. And now it'll trigger thoughts as to, you know, that might have implications in resolution. I should talk to my ready staff. And so we're addressing those issues up front rather than it getting to the end and then, oh, I didn't realize this. So I think it is a really great question. There is a lot of tension, but I think having the discussions really works.
Yeah, we had actually, John and I sat through a briefing 2 weeks ago where one of the supervisory staff was on an examination, and there were some issues that were discovered that really created a lot of questions in my mind, like this could really make a resolution really difficult. And so we sat and we talked about that. So it was, you know, somebody who's an examiner by trade, but was thinking about the implications that these issues that were uncovered during the exam would have on a resolution situation. Yeah, Richard.
I was intrigued by the cultural difference you noted that inspired the formation of this integrated group. And I think it does make a lot of sense. But I also noticed that internationally, we really still have this strong separation between the supervisory colleges and the crisis management groups. I'm wondering how much of an overlap in membership there actually is, and whether other countries actually have the ability to join the two approaches as you do, because you have both a supervisory responsibility and a resolution responsibility. My guess is Elke doesn't have such easy access to supervision, but I don't know. But it does seem logical that those two entities, and there are all sorts of privacy concerns and disclosure of information that would have to be dealt with. But I'm curious about how broadly you think the model can be applied.
Well, I think the FDIC really is in a unique position in this regard. We have statutory supervisory and a backup role authorities on the supervisory realm. Plus, we insure, so we have responsibilities and authorities on the insurance of deposits. We're also a resolution authority. So I don't think there's too many entities that have that combination of authorities, and it puts us in a unique position, which I think we're trying to leverage.
Go ahead.
I think you've spotted the right problem, and that's the problem to make sure that a supervisor who holds on to his child doesn't hold on to the child far too long. And in Europe, we are trying to solve it in our institutional framework, a bit similar to what you do. We are participating in discussion of the supervisor, which for the banks under our remit is in Frankfurt under the ECB. And at the same time, we have them participating in our discussion. But I think it's a topic that you always need to keep just on your mind, because it's my problem and the white knight is just around the corner, to avoid that kind of debate. Now, you are in a better position because you also have supervisory powers. We have formally the chance to do on-site inspection and the deep dives, but we would always be a bit in a situation, are we doubling up to what the supervisor does? Because we are not the supervisor. But in principle, it's the same idea that you have between pooling this into one group to say we need a very constant dialogue also with the supervisor. And over the 8 years, we have developed out of the discussion on why do you need to know, we have now really full access to their information on the supervisory side.
You mentioned that you have supervisors on site, but that's only a few people. Have you changed your expectations of the role of internal audit as well as the audit committee of the boards?
I would say no, we haven't changed our expectation. I think the expectation is still the same. But you know, we do have a small number of on-site, given that we're a backup supervisor. You know, the OCC and the Federal Reserve numbers exponentially are higher than ours, and so we do work closely with them, and we do look at audit, and where audit is considered to be reliable and strong, that, you know, we will look at that as far as, you know, when thinking about, you know, have issues been remediated at the firm. You know, if audit is credible, then that'll go a long way with us to see what, you know, what their findings are as they look at different issues that the firm has addressed.
I would just add, I'm sorry, I would just add that not a shift or difference, but there is an extension now. Audits now focus on resolution issues, and we leverage off of that. And so that's a good development in the firms and the banks, is that they're auditing resolution issues. They're auditing their calculations and their capabilities, so we can leverage off of that. And so it's an extension, but it is relatively new.
I too was thinking about the tension between the supervisors and the resolvers here, the potential tension. Now, a lot of resolutions are triggered by liquidity runs, right? So then the supervisor has no choice, right? But the key would be trying to get in before the run and the fire sale. That would be really a stabilizing intervention. So could you talk a little, and the data coming in on what the actual capital of the institution is very lagged and incomplete, and asset prices are changing very rapidly. So could you talk a little bit about what would trigger the resolution before the liquidity run?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, I would say again, for us, you know, it's having those conversations. We bring resolution is a part of the process throughout. And so if we're starting to even notice that a firm is starting to experience some stress well before you get to an actual liquidity event, we've got our resolution people on board again, you know, through that escalation protocol process. You know, we'll meet and there's more risk here. We're seeing some stress. We're going to move this firm down, and then that triggers resolution readiness, starts doing more to start preparing. So there's not there's an event now, we've got to prepare. All the preparation is going to be done up front prior to that event actually taking place.
One thing I will add to that is that one of the authorities we don't have is we don't charter institutions. So it would be the Fed or the OCC or the states, and they're the ones who would make the decision as to whether or not to pull the keys. But having people there, we're doing the monitoring, so we're real time.
Jump in. It might also be worth, mentioning that one of the real benefits of the Title I review work over the last
decade really has been improved internal governance mechanisms, quantitative triggers, the improvement, and this is also from the supervisory side, internal modeling, capital stress testing, liquidity stress testing, so that even if the regulatory capital numbers don't come to us for 4 weeks, that the firms are expected to have as close to a real-time view of that as possible, and that they have internal governance mechanisms to start engaging in actions as necessary.
And they share that view with you.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, in the GSIB SPOEs, right, there's RLEN, which is liquidity execution need, which is calculated daily, is shared with the supervisors. It's never been tested, so we can't say it's perfect, or that it would work in real life, but it's massively better and different from what we had in 2008. So I think that if GSIB were to go into resolution, itself, it would be pushed into the bankruptcy far before the chartering authority pulls the plug. And RLEN is what is going to tell you to do that.
Sorry, maybe that's.
Yeah, that's right. Just one other question to ask. To what extent or how are you working or integrating the evolution of markets, particularly the treasury markets, into your analysis, given that the liquidation of collateral is so foundational to both recovery and resolution for banks, non-banks, CCP, and every structure out there?
Well, I'll start. We've recognized that, and we have started looking at that. And I don't know if, Andy, you have anything you want to add to that, but it is an area that we don't naturally, as supervisors of resolution, we don't naturally have insights. So we're not the Federal Reserve here, So, but it is an area where we've seen time and again issues occur and issues that affect our institutions. So we are looking now at building up our capabilities in those areas.
So just as part of the advisory board, I would continue to encourage you at look at that interoperability, right? Because we've got, shifting prudential rules that have implications on markets, on treasuries particularly, and we have that reliance, and it's a circle. So I think those are very important things, and I'm glad you're looking at them.
Thank you. Yeah, Andy and I have had several discussions over the last several weeks about building that out more within the systemic risk branch. Hi, Tim.
Hi, just a quick question. I think the coordination is a great idea. I'm glad to hear it. I hope that the interagency coordination is still functioning as well as it was when I was at the Federal Reserve. Focusing on the supervision side, the goal here is really for these firms to be prepared for resolution, and frankly, prepared for take recovery action so they never get to resolution. Plans are great. He noted earlier that the finding of credibility of a plan is a challenging issue. Credibility, frankly, of a plan for one of these firms to be resolved in bankruptcy would be a huge challenge. So on the supervisory side, you have an opportunity to really push in areas that can help to make the firms better prepared and more thoughtful internally, hopefully. But I wonder, I guess there's a question coming here eventually. There's been a lot of discussion about whether the agencies are creating rules through guidance. It's been very prominently raised by the Bank Policy Institute. And it's interesting because, of course, guidance has been somewhat undermined a little bit by statements by the agencies over the past few years. I'm wondering if you think that the way that everything is set up right now is the most effective way for you to achieve getting these firms to be better prepared, or if you think that possibly strengthening some of this guidance into a more rules-based approach would eliminate some confusion and take away some of the criticism that the agencies have faced for making up rules without actually having a rule, which frankly I think is unfair. But anyway, the long question, was that clear enough, or I could repeat, but it was
no, I think it's clear enough. We're the practitioners. We implement and try to implement the guidance, what the rules, what have you. I'll leave it up really to policymakers and others to determine whether those should be rules. Guidance should be rules or what have you. But it's a good question. Yeah.
I mean, we do have a lot of authority, like in Title I, for instance. And I think there are ways to, again, thinking about the supervisory side and how that impacts Title I capabilities, et cetera. There's a lot of authority there that can be used and to push firms to get issues fixed that have direct implications on resolution readiness.
Yeah, that's fair. I guess part of my question was, has any of that ability to influence through that manner been undermined by the talk of guidance shouldn't be taken too strongly? I'm just trying to get a sense of how the dynamic has changed given all the discussion about making rules through guidance that, again, I think has been unfairly aimed at you all.
Yeah,
I'd like to hop in here. I think broadly speaking, when guidance is given, forget about what the guidance is. Clearly, financial institutions need to take that extremely seriously because of the ultimate assessment of whether or not your plan is credible. And then I think there were discussions broadly around what would the implications of certain types of guidance be. So I think the reality is there can be guidance, and two, yes, it's taken extremely seriously.
And if I could just add, when we implemented Title I of Dodd-Frank, we started with a rulemaking that's detailed and really lays out the framework for implementing the Title I authorities for resolution plans. Then we elaborated on the rule, as you well know, through a guidance document to provide greater detail to the institutions for implementing the requirements established under the rule. So I think, I think it's been actually a pretty functional process.
A question for the committee. I think part of what the structure of CISR helps to do is address these twin problems. One is that without that integration, I think resolution risks becoming a paper exercise, the way it's kind of set up. And part of that is the second problem, which is it's very infrequent, right? So knock on wood, that's the intent. But part of that means that memories are short and people forget. I think that on a lot of these resolution issues coming out of the 2008 crisis, everyone was moving in the same direction because it was so present. It was omnipresent as an issue, both on the regulatory side and on the bank side. And as we get further and further from that, we've got new folks who haven't lived those things. Part of the challenge is not having it just live as an ivory tower exercise over here. And then we've got, kind of day-to-day supervision risk management over here. And I think part of that integration is key. I'd be curious to hear from others, like what else needs to be done to keep that front and center? Because I think this gets back to an earlier question about boards and audit committees. That's kind of the daily muscle within organizations. And I think it's very easy to just say, well, that was a long time ago. We've figured this out. It's all good. We can move on from here. I think that's going to be a perennial challenge, especially as we move forward. And there's new risks that come up. And I think you guys will talk about that in a bit. I don't know if folks have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'd share that view. It is one of the problems. You have a peacetime army that doesn't get to fight. And unfortunately, when combat comes, you need lots of troops. You need to get them on board yesterday. And that strikes me as one of the fundamental problems that you have in an agency like this. How do you keep some of those memories alive? I teach some classes to kids who think 2008 was a million years ago, right? And there's a generation of people who lived it, and that generation is slowly moving on. So I do wonder if there are training exercises, ways you can kind of throw in. There have been some war games. I remember actually Jay Powell ran one of those things a long time ago, which was quite useful. They had a former FDIC chairman pretending to be an FDIC chairman on the panel, but throwing in curveballs and throwing in multiple actions into the market and trying to at least get people to think about that as more of a real-time exercise. I think different types of training might be one way that you could preserve that a little longer. It's a tough problem, but I do think your point's very well taken because these things probably don't come in ones and twos when they come. You look at some of the FDIC history, there are some pretty big waves. So I do wonder if there are ways you can use some of those tools to help with that.
I would encourage also the cycle, keeping the cycle reasonably short, 2 years, 3 years for the institutions, because, systems and approach can atrophy otherwise. So I think that's important. The second important point, back to what Wilson was just saying, is also on the crisis management groups, really doing playbook exercises, because again, within 5 to 10 years, everybody turns over. So many of us in this room who lived through all of it will not be sitting around those tables. So I think that's equally important because those two things need to come together.
If I can just add, and it's an important question on the standing army issue, and how do we mobilize in the event of a stress environment? And, you know, we perhaps should have had the table, in addition to these folks who spend their time on the supervision of the largest institution and resolution planning for the largest institution. We have an additional division dedicated to resolving banks on the smaller end of the spectrum, but with very significant operational capabilities and frankly large human resources to draw upon, which also collaborate closely with this complex institution group. So we actually can bring a lot of resources to the table in the event of a stress scenario, and that is, and a large part of the planning of those groups are, if we had to mobilize additional resources, we actually have standing contracts with third parties if we need to, as well as capabilities to call back retired annuitants. I mean, there are in place a whole set of plans that we
Reservists.
to draw upon, and particularly even now, for example, where we are facing, I think, a change in the economic environment and uncertain outlook of what the next 6, 12, 18, 24 months may present. I mean, that triggers a lot of thinking on both the supervisory end and on the resolution end in terms of additional human resource needs and how we might address them as events unfold over the next period.
Perhaps to add, and not to get so militant like army, but we are firefighters. We hope there is no fire, but we need to be trained for all kind of fire and not just to believe it's the old chimney that will burn and this is where you know the answer. But what I find incredibly important, I think the way you're setting it up addresses this, is the cooperation then also between the various institutions. Now, I come with a European mindset. Well, we have 21 national authorities, so you never know which country will be the one you have to deal with. But I find it incredibly important for any cross-border institution that we also train together, have deep dives, have a kind of tabletop so that we all speak the same language. And that we all know what we want to do and how would we work together, be it a European institution with a US arm to it, or be it a US institution with, or in our case, simply be it a cross-European institution. So, and only testing and fire drills are probably the only way I would think of to do so.
Go ahead.
You're probably going to say the same thing. Look, we're all creatures of our past. So when we go through all this resolution, even though we may be forgetting 08, it still heavily influences everything that we do, that we think. I think one of the things that we should be really careful about is the next crisis won't be 08. I don't know a lot. I just know that. I know that for sure. So, you know, if I was sitting in your chairs, I would think, what is the seismic or systemic crisis that's not 08? You know, what happens if we get a major cyber event? What happens if we get a major cloud event? We could just go through these. And how do we deal with those events? And 08, whether we like it or not, there was a sign, there was a windup, there was a pitch, there was a swing, there was a ball flying out. There were a lot of balls that went out of the stadium. We sat there and watched them. The next event, there may not be a sign, a windup, a pitch, and a ball. It just might happen. And so in many of these things, I think we've got to accelerate our thinking because we live in a highly accelerated world. We also live in binary outcome events. And the event most likely
will affect multiple institutions simultaneously.
Yeah, look, I agree with what Gary said, and a question related to that. I think March 2020, it was sort of all hands on deck for a little bit, with a little bit of, but not the same as 08. I'm curious, when was the last time it was sort of all hands on deck for a resolution, even as an exercise? And I think that's, if it's been a long time, it's a good reason to, give it a try.
Well, I think 2020 was all hands on deck. I think the market events that we've had was all hands on deck. The geopolitical events, we've had all hands on deck. A lot of some of the instances that we're going to share with you today are any one of these, to your point before, any one of these could cause a crisis amongst our banks. We need to be ready all the time, and we really don't know when it's going to come, and it could come very fast. So we do maintain a heightened state of readiness. We do exercises both internally and with other agencies and globally. We have protocols and committees set up to constantly work through some of these things. We can't predict it, and we try to build our resolution tools so that they're functional and they'll work in any sort of environment, but we really don't know what's going to happen. But we try to maintain heightened state of readiness.
And just to follow up on what Gary was saying, unfortunate experiences, every time you go through one of those, you're like, there's something I wish that I had, and that it would be interesting to get updates on what those things you identify that, we didn't have this going in, but we could use it the next time.
Yeah, just to amplify those comments as well, I think you have two things here to add. Big picture, how do we horizon scan in a more effective way? And how do we contemplate an economy that is substantially more open, right? You don't have the banking industry writ large as a choke point for the bulk of financial services delivery anymore. You've got open technology architecture, you've got open non-banks, you mentioned that a little bit. So as you think about continuing to shore up this section, which is super important, it's sort of like a balloon. And the answer may or may not be, regulate more, expand powers. But how can we think about under the powers that you all have in collaboration with the other agencies to identify and address these types of risks as they emerge? Because in the end, people are going to care about was the economy impacted by financial instability, regardless of where it came from.
John, you had mentioned right in your introductory remarks that the last time we met, you did not have the data which you needed for non-bank financial institutions. This is what the chairman generally mentioned about non-bank financial institutions. At the beginning, I gather you still don't have it. I've got to believe that this creates a problem not only for you have no ability with the non-banks, but I would think adversely affects your ability to really supervise and plan for the regulated sector. So if all of that is still correct, and to go to what Jay said, we've got a gaping hole and the non-bank sector grows. Now I want to take a radical approach, a suggestion, and go back to something the director mentioned again in his opening remarks, and that is FSOC. There are huge problems with designating and regulating non-bank institutions under FSOC. But why could not FSOC designate just for the purpose of providing data, requiring data to come to you to give you a better overview of what's going on?
I think these guys are going to find that question over their head. But I think you raise an important question, Rajan, and I think this is a subject, obviously, I think all three of us are concerned with as members of the FSOC. I think it's been a focus of attention, if I may say, for the secretary as well. And it's a subject we're hoping to address.
So of course, also the tools to get firm-specific data, to the extent there is I don't think this will be that helpful, but some state regulators that have some insight, but there's also the Office of Financial Research, which has certain authorities to compel and collect data that has been used in a fairly limited fashion. But it's also important to underscore the legal mechanics of invoking Title II for a non-bank requires, I believe, supermajorities of the Fed board, the FDIC board, and sometimes maybe even the SEC has to be involved, consent of the Treasury Secretary, maybe even consultation with the president, and with no real insight as to what is happening other than market signals. And to be able to go in again without a supervisory relationship, without a plan. And yeah, tough. But I don't know what Jim, John, others, if you want to share the thinking you have put into that scenario of how to navigate something like that. Obviously, it's like what Gary said, you don't even know. Well, what are you even going into?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I mean, we do try. It's a difficult. I honestly, it's so vast. Both the authorities, they're very broad authorities, and we don't know where the ends, the boundaries are fully drawn yet. I mean, there is some parameters that companies would have to meet, but we're in a dynamic environment. And then, as far as what the decisions are going to be made at the time, there's going to be several parties involved, and they're always going to have their own perspective. And we'll have to deal with those facts and circumstances at that time. It's hard to plan for that. We do hold conversations, though, with all the key turners to make sure everybody understands their roles and talk about issues. But it's difficult.
I want to maybe try to tie together Gary, Jay, and Sandy's comment, because I do believe that this challenge of how to prep for the future, not fight last year's war, right? It's kind of a perpetual challenge. The exercises that were talked about earlier are really valuable. They are extremely time intensive, and you have to pick wisely. And I think this is one of the challenges, is like, where do you drill? And if you pick that spot, then if you miss, then you expended a huge amount of resources. So I think that does argue for something a bit more modular, smaller, faster, more nimble. What exactly that is, I think we really need to put some thought into how to do that. Because I think that is because I think the environment requires it, because the change is happening much more quickly, and things are not contained within the four walls of the bank anymore. And so I think that does require kind of a bit more creative thinking on that front. It would be interesting to know what other industries do, kind of what's best practice out there. That's something that I think, kind of the collective knowledge of folks at this table and your friends have probably some insight into. So that may be something to kind of think about and pursue in the future. Thanks.
May I just observe, this is really a pretty engaged group here. So, and I'm looking at the clock in our agenda this morning, and maybe perhaps move to our second agenda item. And I think all of these issues continue into the next, so it's not as if we're leaving them behind. But I actually think these next topics will engender further conversation around these issues. John, if that's reasonable.
No, I think you're absolutely right. We're actually naturally leading into the next panel. So why don't we? Thank you. And our next panel, which is going to be the resolution planning update, as we noted, Title II and public transparency and large bank resolution planning. And we will have Deputy Director for Resolution Readiness, Ryan Tetrick, advisors Betsy Falloon and Susan Baker, and our legal counsel, Penn Stark. Presenting.
Thank you and good morning. I'm Betsy Falloon. I'm a senior advisor in the Resolution Readiness Branch, and I'm here to introduce our Title II topic for today. And Chairman and John have mentioned that what we're interested in here is to talk about transparency and ways that we can tell the story of the way we are planning and the way we intend to approach a Title II resolution in a way that enhances everybody's understanding of it and improves confidence in the process and the outcome. At this point, there's a pretty broad awareness of the single point of entry strategy. I think that people are aware of that approach to resolution, which is the one that we think is the most effective. And a lot of steps have been taken to make that approach more actionable, more available in a wider range of scenarios, both in a Title II planning area, but in Title I as well. The firms have taken steps and the agencies as well to improve the firm structures or capabilities. And the single point of entry strategy is now a credible option in a much wider range of scenarios. The planning work in Title I has certainly had a lot of benefits in our Title II readiness as well. And sort of the talk about the firehouse or the standing army. That routine of the resolution planning also helps us because there's always new information and new plans, and we are building upon our planning as the firms build upon their planning. So, over the course of my career, I have seen where resolution planning has become a truly full-time, year-round job, which is way different than in the early years where we came in and out. In good times you do deals, and in bad times you do resolution. But we recognize that this is hard, and comments have been made about how it's hard to know exactly what to be ready for, and we certainly know that being ready for the last crisis is not the answer, although certainly also we need to have learned from the last crisis and remember those lessons and keep that muscle memory, but at the same time not be trapped by the expectations of the past. As I mentioned, we use the Title I plans as a foundation for our resolution analysis in Title II. And in Title I reviews, we are now using capabilities testing more so that as part of our Title I review, so to validate the capabilities that the firms have described in their plans and the capabilities that we rely on in Title II for our readiness. Arlen was mentioned, and that's certainly a capability that we think about a lot in Title II readiness, as well as in understanding, the risks associated with the Title I plans. We have a systemic resolution framework that we have built out, which is sort of our roadmap for how we think about Title II execution. And we've been working, at this point, we're building in details, we're building in templates, we're trying to make this framework an actionable set of steps. And an important part of that is internal tabletops and exercises. We try to do a lot of that, both, the high investment, high yield ones, where if we get it right, it's really good. And we've had a few of those. And also we try to look for opportunities where we have, low cost exercises. We call them pop X's, but just a quick, not a lot of build up. How would you do it if this happened? Take this firm, take this scenario, send some staff and go. And those are ways that we can, I'm not going to say build muscle memory because it's not quite true, but create the teams, create the expectation, keep the the knowledge fresh and also identify where we have gaps and where we need to do additional work. Certainly coordination among all the financial regulatory agencies is, critical to our readiness. And I think John mentioned the ongoing work that we do with key turning authorities, which is really important. And we also coordinate with staff on a staff level with staff at Treasury to make sure that the orderly liquidation fund, which is funded ex post and is a different approach than what we use with the deposit insurance fund, that we have a staff level understanding of what it takes to make sure that we're ready to move that money timely, and that everybody knows what their job is to accomplish that. And of course, there's been a lot of talk about our cross-border engagement, and in CMGs and outside of CMGs, we have a lot of engagement with supervisory and resolution authorities around the world to make sure that we have, as much as possible, a shared understanding of the steps that we might take, the steps that they might take, and that we talk about the work that we've done in, to keep those issues fresh and to keep those relationships fresh. And all of this really supports our readiness and keeps us busy while we're in the firehouse. Next slide, please. So the topic here is transparency, and we are very mindful that confidence is critical to the success of a resolution in any case and in every case, but particularly in this case where we would be exercising authorities for the first time. And the key to confidence always is setting expectations. Do stakeholders understand the process? And it is being executed consistent with those expectations. So we have taken steps to build awareness and understanding, and are sort of looking for ways to continue to do so. So for instance, we've been very, very transparent about our Title I resolution planning work. The guidance is published, Q&As are published, public portions of the plans are made available to the public on the agency's websites. Our feedback letters are open to the public and are also posted on websites. So it's an open process, and I think that there's a lot of information available there. Certainly, I've mentioned that we work with other regulators and regulatory authorities to have a shared understanding with those stakeholders. And in 2013, we published a notice in the Federal Register about the single point of entry approach to resolution, and to make that, that strategy that we had developed available so the public and other stakeholders would understand and be aware of that approach to resolution. We continue to talk about Title II resolution. There's been speeches about it. We talk about it in a lot of different venues. Some of them are in small group venues, and some, like this one, are open to the public and are a way for us to tell our story. But what we want to do and what we want to ask you about is, what do we need to do to better set expectations, to power our, our communications and improve confidence when the time comes. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Susan Baker.
Hi. As Betsy conveyed, we've done a lot about transparency in terms of resolution planning. It's all out there on the website. What we want to think about and what we're starting to work on now is how to improve transparency about our execution plans for Title II resolution. We've been working on these for 10 years now, and we should probably be starting to say more things publicly. So what do we want to think about today is, what should we be transparent about now that would help improve confidence in the event that we're called to use our Title II authorities. And we've been thinking about this across, many dimensions. First, we look at who we need to be transparent for. And we have a large number of lists on this slide that you can see. We've done a lot of work with policymakers and regulators around the world, has been said, and a lot of engagement with certain parts of the firm. So the slides on the right, we've probably done more on, but what do we need to be thinking about for the stakeholders, the general public, customers, counterparties, other people like that? We think about what message do these stakeholders need to hear, and it might not all be the same. And then we think about when we need to be transparent. And I know that there's going to be a temptation for us to say, for people to say, FDIC should just lay it all out there. Say what you're going to do every step along the way. And that pre-commitment will help improve confidence. But we also need to be mindful of the need for FDIC to have operational flexibility to adjust to the specific facts and circumstances on the ground. Next slide, please. So this slide is some topics that we're considering, the what of what we need to be more transparent about. And so what we would like to hear from you is which of these topics or others that might not be on here, thinking about contracting authority, which I took off the slide and now maybe I shouldn't have. What are the things that would be helpful to get out in the public domain to improve confidence now? So some of the things we've heard about obviously are, what are the key decisions that the FDIC has to make? When would you decide the framework? Is it going to be, is Title I bankruptcy going to work, or do we need to turn keys for Title II, which basically hinges on the need for liquidity through the OLF, I think. How do we decide the resolution strategy? Does the firm have enough capital to make an SPOE work, or do we need to be thinking about an MPOE? Do we need to be more transparent about how we coordinate cross-border, how it would differ if we're a home or a host? For example, we get questions about planning for the bridge as well. Who's going to run this bridge? What assets and liabilities will go into it? And how will the FDIC oversee what's happening at the bridge and maintain that for a public confidence perspective as well? We're thinking about creditors. How do you communicate with claimants, including about their claims determination? How will the losses be allocated on the Dodd-Frank hierarchy, which is different than under FDI Act and under bankruptcy? And then how will the claimants be compensated? How does securities for claims process work? We mentioned that in the 2013 thing that Betsy mentioned earlier. We're also wondering if we need to be more transparent about some of the accountability mechanisms that we have as well for the general public audience. We are required to remove culpable management. How would we go about doing that? Do we need to re-emphasize that in the Dodd-Frank hierarchy that compensation claims are subordinated to general creditors and that prior compensation could even be clawed back if it? And then finally, there's the funding mechanism. What part of that would be most helpful to boost confidence? I do think that the OLF and using it as the big gift, it's not a gift, but the big tool that we need in Title II to help provide confidence. But what do people need to know to really get that? How important is it to explain the rules and the mechanics for the OLF? How money will get from point A to point B? How would we use targeted guarantees to allay concerns about excess cash use? There's a lot of questions here. And so, there are a lot of things we've been thinking about, and what we want to hear from you today is what you think the priorities would be in order to go about setting expectations appropriately in public about how we would execute Title II, so that if and when we do have to have that announcement on Friday night, ideally Friday night, that people are in a position to receive it, understand it, and say, yeah, that works. And we can see how this will happen. Of course, there will be doubters, but there's a lot of things going on. So with that.
First of all, I'd like to praise the FDIC for its unrelenting pressures to have more disclosure under the actual public reports. I think they have been very helpful. Second, I guess I am a bit pessimistic about your ability to communicate with the people who really need to know in terms of a crisis. And this is partly from my experience of teaching this stuff. There was a lot of interest just after the crisis. It's dwindled over time. And so people are sort of less and less interested in getting into the nitty-gritty and some of the really interesting developments. So I would think your strategy ought to be to disclose as much as possible to people who professionally need to know about it. And that would certainly include the ratings agencies and the people within the banks who are responsible for these judgments. And simply have publicly available a place where people can go if they need to know more. Because we're dealing with a society where people are getting their information in tweets. There's just no patience, I think, for going through the elaborate and careful planning that has gone on. It should be there. It should be accessible when people need to know. But I don't think you have much hope of reaching a public that doesn't have a professional need to know.
I completely agree with that. I almost think you'd scare the public if you put this out. Like, why are they telling me this? Should I be concerned about my bank? Like, my insurance company doesn't tell me what they're doing with my assets. They just assume they're going to pay my claim, right? I think you've got to think of the unintended consequences of taking a public that has more full faith and confidence in the banking system than maybe people in this room do, that we want them to have full faith and confidence in the banking system. They know the FDIC insurance is there. They know it works. They put their money in, they're going to get their money out. So there's a select crowd of people that are in the institutional side. And if they want to understand this, they're going to find a way to understand this. There's a bunch of law firms represented in this room. There's a bunch of people that'll charge them by the hour a lot of money to explain this all to them. And it's fine. I don't have a problem with that. And they all have huge staffs. But I would be careful about the unintended consequences of starting to blast too much of this out in the general public.
So I'd like to take a slightly different view, that maybe a middle ground in the center. First of all, I think, Susan and Betsy, what you've done and the thoughtfulness here is extraordinary, and I want to give you respect for it. I do think there's more that could be put out in the public, perhaps not just on Title II, but also on Title I, in a way that isn't scary to folks. I mean, Gary, there's a timing question, right? We're at a delicate moment now, so if it goes out tomorrow, it might have a different impact than if Susan and Betsy do their work and it goes out as we're moving out of the recession. But I'm very big on transparency. I think transparency leads to accountability. The FDIC has to have flexibility. So there are some ways that you could get out some basics, which say, we could do this, we could do that. We will be holding these folks accountable. We have these powers, we have these authorities. Without putting too much out there. I get that we live in a tweet world, but that 1994 book that the FDIC did on this, I mean, that's a Bible, right? And so folks who want to know about it. One final thing is, I think that there's an additional group of stakeholders that exist today that need to know more about resolution planning that didn't exist when we started on this journey. And that is the kind of fintech, non-bank lenders, money transmitters, digital assets, crypto exchanges, whatever we want to call them. I know you've listed domestic authorities, and I think there are states that are starting to think, should we have a resolution plan? And there's so much learning here that could be of benefit to those who are thinking about different kinds of resolution plans, and they would be very different if you could put a little bit out more in public. So I'd go for more, maybe not the whole hog.
Perhaps to build on those comments, I can share, when I go to Parliament, the first question is, when will you become more transparent? The second question is, when are you giving us more information? And then when we published in summer our first assessment of resolvability, I could count on one German newspaper, at least commenting that we published something. Then our gossip magazine Politico had a short article. And that's it. When I went to Parliament the next time, they said, when will you be more transparent? When I referred to this, I knew no one had read it. So, but I think the simple argument is, and there I would full-heartedly build on your comment, you need to probably have on your website, and I know you have already a lot on this, how does Title II work? What can you expect from the institutions to do in case of a bit stylized? And this can go out on a normal sunny day. You need to be mindful that it doesn't go out and everyone scratches head why are they doing it now? But I think a number of the other topics are probably topics for, well, we would call it guidance paper, where you give more detail to those that have either an academic or an institutional desire to know, but they are not really top of priority for the public. Now, the one difference between us, I've always envied you for that, is that you have these summaries of Title I plans. We are not talking about any individual banks, so you will find from us a comment on GSIPs. On average, everything is fine. You will find a comment on mid-size and the like, but you will never find any detailed bank-specific comment, a topic that our parliament is talking about.
So just to sort of, again, looping these three together from my perspective, I think when you're going to make, I believe in transparency, but it has to have a meaning. So if the people that are getting the transparency need to be able to do something with it. So for example, when we have a terrorist alert and we give it a color, but we don't know where it is, how we respond, that's transparent, but not particularly productive, except that we should worry. So I think here we've got to do this sort of same sort of thinking. How and what should be used by the general public? And that's sort of minimal and sort of basic framework. And two, what transparency can you provide that will lend stability in a negative outcome? And that's more about not publishing, claimant communication. That's going to be more about, you're going to come out and say, we've got this, we've got a strategy for this, we are confident we can work through it. So that's sort of, I think, the way that you should be thinking about the communication. And with regard to accountability, yes, that's at some point, that's sort of a stage 2. I think you definitely need to do it, but that's not your first order communication. Your first order communication is, we've changed management, right? So those would be sort of a framework that I would offer up to think about, which I think you sort of have here.
I'd like to go back to some of Dick's early comments. I do think it is hard to get a lot of demand for transparency right now in this sort of period of peacetime, but that is going to flip, and it's going to flip probably even faster than we saw in 2008, where the need for communications really quickly in the social media world to avoid disinformation, to have some holding patterns for things like, I remember in the early days of bail-in, people saying they're coming for my deposits, right? So just holding communications that you can pull out that are helpful to deal with disinformation, some very simple things, and how quickly you'll be able to deal with different constituencies. For example, as liabilities are further up and closer to harm's way, when are you going to be able to give them some comfort, if any? How do you deal with foreign operations? How do you communicate to some of those different groups? I think ex-ante preparation for the speed of scaling up and the ability to get information out to avoid rumors taking over the narrative strikes me as probably the place that feels like it's got the most benefit in a world where I think you've done a pretty good job of getting out the basics of Title II and some of the basic resources that are available now.
Can I just make a general comment, which will be totally unhelpful and unproductive, because I don't know the answer to it, but it never stopped me from saying anything like that before, so I'll do it again. Transparency is only helpful and effective if it's accurate. And that sounds obvious, but in my experience with resolution issues, and in this world of interoperability between institutions, it seems to me more times than not, the regulators are sort of the quarterback in this, and they're getting bilateral information, but the neural network of institutions that really should be talking to each other to help aren't doing it. And so information becomes disinformation because everybody's waiting for each other to clarify. So my point is, to have accurate transparency, it needs to be underpinned by a foundation of a solid neural network within the industry among the institutions who are involved in this. And that's not easy. But I think it's something that we need to really think about and work on, because if we don't, it's just going to spin.
Can I follow up on that? I think, look, I think this is an incredibly important point. You see it, any statement that's made, whether it's made by a regulator or an institution, is going to be tested by the market.
Peacetime.
And we have to understand that. And I think that just putting the 2 points together, what you want to have out there today is something that when you make a statement in a time of stress, it provides that underpinning for the statement. And I think that's the way to think about the body of work that you have out there. And it's kind of a dynamic relationship for when you have to make a stabilizing statement.
I wondered whether there are some market tests of whether you're being heard. And I think about TLAC. So TLAC spread should respond to good and bad news about the institutions. And it's really important. I mean, it's a little bit conflicted, right? I mean, it's important that people understand they can be bailed in, but you don't want a huge run on the institution. But they're going to be. And it could be an early warning signal to the FDIC and the primary regulators when these things happen. And there may be some other prices, this is similar to what Jay was saying, in the market that you can tell whether people understand who's going to be protected, who isn't going to be protected. It would be, I think, an interesting study to look at the evolution of market prices in a situation like March of 2020, for example, and see whether people understood what might happen.
I might go further than that, Don, because I think that you look at the evolution, I think we have to sit down and talk to long-term debt investors and make sure that they, as a stakeholder group, fully understand bank debt today is not what it was before. It is not principal protected by design. And I think that that expectation, I like how you started off, Betsy, like it's all about expectation setting. And I think that is absolutely critical. If that doesn't hold, this whole thing doesn't hold. And so I think it's one area to focus on. I do want to go back to something Jay said about stabilizing statements. In my experience, they're not stabilizing. If you have to make a stabilizing statement, you're in real trouble. And I think that part of that means that there's a lot of pre-work that needs to be done such that those statements aren't seen as a reach. Because if they're seen as a reach, the market sniffs that out in 2 seconds and actually has the opposite impact. And this is one of those big challenges, like what can be done ahead of time so that it's all going as planned, hands off the wheel. This is part of what we've been prepared for, because that's what builds confidence.
You just said very well what I was trying to say.
So I think the most stabilizing comments have not been coming from the FDIC. They've been coming after the CCAR tests. And so there's been a consistent approach now for over 10 years of pronouncements coming out about the banks, about how much capital they're able to return, how much stock they can buy back, what kind of dividends they can pay. And that consistency, the market understands that. Even the common public will understand that. They know how to read those headlines. I think what we talked about here with the FDIC's role of having this available for institutions, have it available somewhere. The professional markets understand it. But I think right now the more stabilizing factor is that we've had 10 plus years of reports on stress testing, on capital levels, on dividend levels, et cetera. And maybe we should think more about, is there a way to make that more transparent or eliminate some of the jargon, et cetera. But what you're doing, I think, is excellent work, but maybe should be more for professional investors and available to anybody.
Just a quick comment back to Mike and Mike's comments about TLAC spreads and Don's as well. I still kick myself for not buying some during the COVID crisis. They went wide. Feel stupid about that. There have been some events in Europe over the last decade, and TLAC and cocoa spreads have spiked out and come back in on idiosyncratic stuff. So I think the market has generally been behaving as we would hope it to behave. Some of the academic studies I've seen, I know Daryl Duffy and a few people did a big study on some of the too big to fail premium, and it seems to be working okay. We haven't really run the thing through a proper test. I hope we don't have to in the near future, but at least all the ex-ante signals about credit market spreads and whether it's systemic or idiosyncratic seem to be sending decent signals from what I can tell.
following up on that very quickly, in the very early days of the committee, we used to measure sort of how well we were doing with whether the kind of debt we were looking at the bank or at the holding company differed. And it was really a couple of years before the markets got the message that there really is a different credit risk here, that there are different priorities in play. So I very much would support Wilson's view, and that's a healthy thing. Somebody understands the rules, which is good.
This is a fantastic discussion, and thank you for all your input. And I think it confirms a lot of what we're thinking, and it gave us a lot of new things to think about. We're running well behind on the agenda here, which is not a bad thing, but I'd like to turn it over to Ryan Tetrick to talk about the resolution of non-GSIB large banks.
Thanks, John. And, you know, part of the lesson of resolution planning is you need to be prepared to execute on a compressed time frame. See how this goes. So if we can turn to, so we're on slide 14. So I should just start by acknowledging that this is the first time that we're discussing a large bank resolution in the SRAC, and explain why we think it's the right time to do so. You know, the policy response to the great financial crisis understandably focused on the largest and most systemic institutions. At the same time, we at the FDIC have taken a number of meaningful steps to improve large bank resolvability, and have long been attentive to the significant challenges that are posed by what are sometimes referred to as regional banks or DSIBs, but I'll just simply call them large banks for this discussion. You know, while compared to GSIBs, the failure of a large bank might be relatively less threatening to financial stability. It still may be highly costly and result in significant disruption to local communities and potentially to the wider financial system, especially if it occurs in the context of a wider economic downturn. Our goal for this presentation is really simply just to introduce some of the challenges that we see with resolving these institutions, and discuss some of the strategic options that might be available to us. You know, during the global financial crisis, the FDIC handled the failure of the largest IDIs with creative and dynamic responses, but the options that were available to us were limited and undesirable. A costly conservatorship in the case of NDMAC, and the sale of Washington Mutual to a GSIB, which was really only possible because it had a large pre-existing stock of long-term debt to absorb losses, and because it had already been marketing itself in the run-up to its failure, and so JP Morgan had conducted significant due diligence by the time the institution failed. So it's fair to say that the challenges and tricky issues here are underexplored publicly and not fully resolved. I promise we won't resolve them in this discussion. We'll just get started here. So really on slide 14, just a quick flyover of the FDIC authority under which these institutions would be resolved. The FDIA is the only regime available for resolving insured depository institutions. And importantly, the depositor class is senior to unsecured creditors. And the depositors, uninsured depositors would share losses pari passu with the Deposit Insurance Fund, which covers insured depositors. Every resolution must pass the least cost test, which means that the FDIC must execute the resolution that is least costly, or a resolution that is least costly to the Deposit Insurance Fund. So that really comes into play only when there are losses into the depositor class and therefore costs to the DIF in paying insured depositors. We have bridge authority, which would work a lot like the types of bridge authority that we have talked about in Title II, except that for an insured depository institution, it's a new deposit-taking entity chartered by the OCC rather than a company formed by the FDIC. I think it's well understood that the Deposit Insurance Fund is available to fund the costs of the resolution in terms of the administrative expenses during the course of the resolution, the payment of insurance, but really importantly for the resolution of large banks, which will almost certainly fail due to liquidity. The DIF is a source of temporary liquidity as well. It's large, pre-funded, but also backstopped by significant borrowing authority ultimately by U.S. Treasury. And the scale of the liquidity that we have in the DIF is actually in some ways greater than relative to the institutions that would be resolved, the Orderly Liquidation Fund in Title II. So we have significant liquidity that we can use to facilitate one of these resolutions. Right. So moving to slide 15, just
quickly, which institutions do we have in mind here? So generally, in this discussion, we're talking about IDIs with over $100 billion in assets that are not subsidiaries of US GSIBs. But from a resolution strategy perspective, there's nothing magic that happens at that $100 billion line. There's nothing magic that happens at the $250 billion line. The issues are really similar. They just become more pronounced as the institutions get larger. Also, I think, we find that large banks tend to be generalized as having a very simple structure, a holding company with 95% of all assets and activity in the IDI subsidiary conducting traditional banking activity. And part of the objective of this slide is just to break down that mental model just a little bit. That holds for many institutions, but there's a little bit more complexity here than might at first be apparent. Some of these institutions, they obviously have more diversified businesses than smaller banks, and some of them even have Title I designated critical operations. In the first couple of rows here, you're focusing on the impact of size on strategy, and again, there's not much difference between over 250 and under 250. It's really a matter of degree, and looking at how saleable are these institutions in a resolution. Very limited possible acquirers for any of the institutions in these categories. And really want to touch on the model line institutions. If you think about it from a resolution strategy perspective, if they're failing, they have some specialized business that they're involved in, and it's almost certain that that's part of what's impaired, and that makes preserving franchise value through the course of the resolution significantly more difficult. And then it's just something that we tend to see with the institutions in that category. They have more operations outside the bank chain, making operational continuity more of a challenge for us in resolution. And then, IDI subsidiaries of FBOs, similarly, operational continuity is a challenge as they have relationships with foreign affiliates, with the parent, in terms of shared services, shared data, shared personnel, those sorts of things. All right, so slide 16. These are some of the unique challenges that we see from a resolution perspective when considering large banks, and would be interested to hear from the committee if these are the right considerations or if there's others that we should be focused on. I'll quickly step through them. Here we're distinguishing the large bank resolution both from GSIB resolution under Title II, but also from the resolution of ordinary community banks. And in a way, they combine a lot of the toughest challenges of each, plus the burden of high expectations. I think everybody's going to remember the challenges with failing SIFIs from the global financial crisis. But for large banks, the expectations are probably closer to the failure of an ordinary bank that the FDIC tends to handle routinely and swiftly. So just starting the challenges box, the first few here, generally speaking, relate to strategic options, and the latter get into operational challenges just in carrying out the resolution. But obviously, as touched on already, just from the standpoint of capacity, the capital and operational resources that would be needed, there are very few institutions that could acquire a large bank. And it'll be especially difficult at the time of failure on a compressed timeline. There's no minimum loss absorbency requirement for these institutions. Some of them do have long-term debt that could absorb losses, but there's no requirement. And that means that there could be increased costs, and it could limit the strategic options available to the FDIC, particularly if the depositor class is impaired. Franchise value might be destroyed, and it might make it harder for bridge and sale strategies to pass the least cost test. They don't have a debt structure that supports a single point of entry type of resolution that's sometimes contemplated for these institutions. But without that structure there, that means entry at the IDI, which is, for these institutions, a very complex operating company. If we're using a bridge, that means that over the weekend, it'll involve the transfer of thousands of employees and a wide array of services, assets, and contracts to that bridge institution over the weekend. I've noted the challenges with operational continuity, in addition to some services being outside the bank itself. They also just haven't fully addressed the impediments to maintaining operational continuity and resolution that some of the larger firms have, and to the same degree. So the next handful of challenges here, I know there are a lot of challenges, which is part of the message. Get into the receivership entity itself. So, there's a large number of deposit accounts that we would need to handle at the time of resolution. For the largest banks, 10, 20, up to 40 million deposit accounts, and more complex account types than for smaller banks. So, pass-through relationships and things like that would be harder to work through. And then, of course, large portions of the deposit balances are uninsured, ranging from 40 to 50% for these institutions on average. And then, just other challenges around receivership management, the receivership entity that the FDIC would be responsible for. It'll depend largely on the complexity of the complexity and scale of the assets that are left behind in the receivership. It could be significantly simplified if we're selling the institution or using a bridge, and much is moving to that. I should just note that in the event that we have to undertake a liquidation where everything stays in the receivership, the operational challenges are quite daunting in that circumstance. The last two challenges here kind of touch on the path to failure and the point of failure. They obviously, they have more complex business lines, and the fact that we're going to need to make projections about valuations through the course of a bridge period makes our assessment of the potential cost of resolution at the time of failure more difficult. And then combine that with the fact that they're almost certainly going to fail due to a run on liquidity. There'll be an abbreviated runway, which will further reduce the time that we have to conduct valuations and to market the institution. So those are the challenges. There are a few advantages. Importantly, as was touched on in the first panel, we maintain a dedicated on-site presence at these institutions. It's hugely valuable in understanding these companies day to day. And then also in the runway to resolution, when one of these banks fails, we'll have ready access to the sorts of technical information that we need to be prepared to resolve one of them. We maintain two resolution-specific record-keeping requirements that relate to large bank resolution. One requires these banks to be able to calculate deposit insurance within 24 hours, notice from the FDIC, and provide that to us within 24 hours. And another requires certain of these institutions to provide us with position-level QFC data so that we can assess their derivatives portfolio and make decisions in a timely way over a resolution weekend. And then, of course, we have an IDI-specific resolution planning requirement, which increasingly involves not just the plan submission, but engagement around the planning process with the institutions on an ongoing basis. So that's a lot. I'll stop there, and I'm interested for any reaction before we move on.
I'm curious as to, it seems that to me that at this scale of failure, the likely cause is probably a macro event that's likely to affect multiple institutions at once. And I'm curious as to how you feel about your ability to collectively coordinate all of that, and how you think about the scenario planning about how what you do with one institution may impact what happens at another institution and kind of the knock-on effect of that.
Yeah, so that could be the case, right? There could be something particular that a particular bank is doing, and it's an idiosyncratic failure. But it could be a larger downturn, and there's multiple institutions under stress at the same time. Part of and we'll get into this in the next part of this discussion. Part of the challenge here is that there isn't a built-in strategy the way that there is for GSIB resolution. And the GSIB model, really relies on the resources of the institution, single point of entry, and we're relying on sort of maintaining operations that limits the resource need on the FDIC. Now, bridge strategies for a large bank can look a lot like that. The challenge is there's not a built-in exit. So We try to focus on strategies that reduce the resource need of the FDIC. We can't control the timeline, but there is decision-making with the other authorities about when and which weekend institutions fail on. So, we would hope to not be resolving multiple institutions at the same time. But there's, significant challenges with multiple are failing at once. And then just to the latter part of your question about the impacts on other institutions, this is one of the reasons why we're really focused on the impact, particularly on uninsured depositors. Because if there's a resolution that's impacting uninsured depositors, and there are similarly situated banks, I think we'd be concerned about what the knock-on effects would be to those uninsured depositors at other banks who are seeing, haircuts occur at the bank that's being put into resolution.
You probably don't need any extra challenges, but I want to throw two more in. One is for acquirers. As you get bigger, a lot of regulatory tests escalate. So it's not just the cost of the institution, it's the cost across your whole institution where everything would be held to higher capital and CCAR standards, et cetera. That's similarly true for foreign banks. Foreign banks find it more expensive to operate cross-border than they used to. So I think your pool of cross-border buyers also is difficult. So I think in terms of what happens to buyers in this group, I think is important. The second one is legal tail. I remember a few years ago, I think it was Jamie Dimon said, if I tried to do this again, my board had asked me to have a psychological examination, that I picked up a lot of lawsuits with acquisitions. Those are very difficult to do diligence on in the kind of time frame you're looking at, and the costs are huge. So I don't know if there's any ways you can mitigate some of those risks for an acquirer, if there are any tools you have in terms of making it a cleaner institution to purchase, but that strikes me as another thing that in this kind of compressed time frame for these scales of institution could be quite difficult.
Just quickly respond and say, because there may be limited acquirers just in terms of capacity, our planning, we know we can't depend on an acquirer being available. So we sort of looking at solutions that allow us to market an institution over time out of a bridge rather than compressed over a weekend. But we are looking at things that we can do to at least expand the range of scenarios when an acquirer could pick up one of these institutions quickly. Legal risk is a good thing to look into, but there are regulatory barriers, particularly for the largest institutions, that would need to be overcome.
But also, Ryan, I think as far as the legal risk, as we said, WAMU came on us very quickly, and everything was transferred over. We had the option to retain certain liabilities in the receivership and pay them pursuant to the priority scheme. So it's possible that we could offer Jamie Dimon a different option next time that may be more interesting.
I won't comment on that one. Just a couple things spring to mind. One, these large institutions, and by the way, I should start with, I completely appreciate you want to have a more prescriptive approach to getting information and creating a playbook. But the starting point, I would say, is one, you have liquidity and capital stress testing, which obviously improve the shock absorbency. When I think about the Title I, Title II resolution plans for GSIBs, they were driven by, one, making sure that critical operations would continue, there would be opportunity for recapitalization, and to make those institutions internalize the costs of externalities they create, because they created such systemic risk. I didn't hear those components here. And I'm not saying you don't go down this path, but maybe you talk about it a little bit differently, because these, size was the other thing that jumped out. Size not necessarily equaling risk. So something big and simple, right? As long as you have the right information, you're going to be able to resolve in a very traditional sense to the way you would draw a smaller scale banking institution. So I would posit size, be careful on. You could be a lot smaller and create a lot more complexity and be a lot more destabilizing. And then the question also I would push on, I love the recognition of monoline being a problem, because I think it sort of can be. But I would also say when you look at some of these small banks and the 40 to 50% uninsured depositors, we also have to make sure, and I think you were leading down this path, that, if it's not systemic, those components can fail. That's a terrible thing to say, But the reality is, I think also collectively want to be careful of bailouts and moral hazards that would be potentially embedded. So I think we're on the right path of thinking about it. Part of the wording we might want to use a little bit differently, because you're not necessarily dealing with systemic institutions and forcing them to bear the externalities, which is why you drove Title I, Title II for the GSIBs. And you also have this good cushion of liquidity and capital stress testing. I would just offer up that as you think through how you present it.
I think this is very thoughtful, and I think it's good that the FDIC and the Fed are thinking about this right now. One thing we need to be crystal clear on is that the imposition of a long-term debt requirement on banks that don't have a lot of long-term debt right now in a rising interest rate environment means that you would be imposing enhanced, increased today costs to solve a contingent problem. And that has to be very, very carefully balanced. And so as you're doing your analysis on the APNR, I would hope that that's a place where you would be doing a very, very deep dive. Another deep dive, thinking about the uninsured deposits, which some of them might be hot money and some of them might be sticky, in the sense that if it's brokered deposits, it's hot. But if it's Joe's auto body shop making payroll, it's sticky. And so I would hope, as you're doing the good and careful thinking around this APNR, that there could be some data-driven analysis around that, because there's a lot of challenges to think through here.
I've said not to add, to add challenges. I think one thing to be seen, we could see it from on our side, but I think also Washington Mutual was already mentioned. The first guarantee to successful resolution is that it comes early enough at a point where there is still franchise left, which gets us back to the discussion we had in the first round. The second part, and gets us back probably to supervisory presence and realistic assessment. The second one is clearly something we are contemplating, is you might not be able to find a qualified buyer for the whole thing, but you might be able, as part of your resolution planning, to say there are buckets to be prepared. Now, it's very simple to say they need to be prepared. If it takes 2 years, that's far too long. So really in resolution planning already to think about whether there are chances to produce buckets for which increase your optionality if need be without really jeopardizing the firm. And I won't comment on the question what to do with a bank which has a balance sheet. Here is equity, there are deposits, and nothing is in between, which is the challenge in this topic.
But I think, for example, in Europe, you generally force MREL on banks that are smaller than GSIBs, a lot smaller, and same thing in the UK. So from an international competitiveness issue, we're in a pretty different place from other jurisdictions that have wrestled with this. I agree with Meg that this needs to be done in a calibrated way. We have a different market. On the other hand, if we're going to internalize an externality, it is going to be a cost of dealing with a contingency. And it's a question of, does that cost go to the diff and get spread around everybody else, including the people who are behaving virtuously? Or is it internalized to the institution? That would be difficult to resolve. I would think as a matter of economics, you generally want to lean towards the latter.
And it's interesting, one of the tools we don't have here is contingent capital, which is what MREL has, right? And there's been a tax blocker on that. And that may well be something that, as you're going through the process of thinking through this, is to rethink whether that tax blocker is appropriate.
I think that's a very important point, because that extra layer of liabilities really gives you a lot more option and time in dealing with it. I'm reminded of something that the OFCR did, the Office of Financial Research did. I probably put an extra C in it some time ago, where they looked at the GSIB scores of all of the major U.S. banks. And I can say, from the point of view of a professor who grades, it was very nice to see a huge break point between the GSIBs and everybody else. I haven't seen that updated now that we've had several mergers. And I'm wondering if using those I'm not sure that they're not perfect metrics, but they are well recognized, if they look closer together than they once did. But in the original cut, there was just a really comforting break between the GSIBs and everybody else. Could have been reverse engineered. I wouldn't say it wasn't, but nonetheless, it did indicate they were quite different. If they become more alike, then I think it's a much easier sell to say, we know this problem, we know how to deal with it, and these things should be extended.
So as I respond to that, maybe we can turn to the next slide. I think if you look, there's still pretty significant grade distribution on those scores. They may have tightened some, but I guess part of the way that we think about systemic risk is it's not necessarily binary. It depends on the scenario and when one of these institutions is failing. If it's in the context of a wider stress, a regional bank, could be disruptive. So just, we've touched on a lot of this here, but just quickly, and how do we think about what's the right strategy? There's not a single answer. These are the broad, 3 approaches that we think about, but we really focus on the middle option here, the use of a bridge bank. We've talked about why a sale to a third-party acquirer would be a significant challenge. A liquidation would be extremely costly. For a bridge bank, one thing that we're looking very, very closely at is that there's a big difference between a bridge in which we can pass all deposits and a bridge in which we can only pass insured deposits. And if there are losses incurred by the depositor class, then that makes it harder to pass the least cost test and to pass all deposits. It also means that the franchise is probably significantly destroyed at that point. And then, importantly, a bridge strategy, that's not an exit. That's only half a strategy. You need an exit to have a full strategy. And so, while we focus on making the bridge itself feasible, we think about some of the ways that we could exit from a bridge. And certainly, being able to more readily break up parts of these institutions by lines of business, regional franchises, just sales of portfolios, and looking at that in advance, that's very helpful, and it could help with the multiple acquirer type exit. We think about, whole bank type exits, maybe over time, if there's time to market out of a bridge, you could have a single acquirer, you could have an IPO type exit. And if there's significant long-term debt, you could contemplate a bail-in type exit for these institutions too, where you're turning the institution over to its creditors. The problem is that, the FDIC is not going to want to be in a bridge for an extended period of time. And these institutions are very large, and so executing any of those options could take a long time, and there's not a built-in exit strategy like there is for GSIBs. And maybe I'll just turn to the last slide here. Just acknowledge, there's, in addition to building up our own operational capabilities to operate a large bridge, these are some of the things that we're doing to enhance large bank resolvability. Obviously we have the IDI resolution planning process. We're strengthening that, starting with a number of submissions that are coming in this year. We've committed with the Federal Reserve to provide guidance to Category 2 and 3 institutions, so some of the largest banks that file Title I resolution plans. And then we've noted the ANPR on long-term debt, and we look forward to seeing the comments on those come in towards the end of the year. I think that's it on this topic.
Thank you, Ryan.
I just throw in one comment goes back to something that Dick brought up, which was, is there a dividing line in terms of these systemic risk scores? One of the things I do worry about is sort of the continuity of the U.S. banking system. We've had our 8 GSIBs since they got designated. They stuck there. None of them have de-GSIB'd. And in terms of the other banks, they tend to be trying to stay within their buckets. And I worry that we've created some of these discontinuities, that there's no sort of ramp up, that you cross a line, all of a sudden you go into full Title I, planning full TLAC, et cetera. It would seem to me that there is no bright line that really just magically separates that bank that's a millimeter over the line from one that's not quite so much over the line. And that if I was thinking about a system that would work smoother, that'd be more future-proofed as banks want to grow and scale becomes important, that having some ramp into some of those capabilities that would give you options, whether to bail in on its own resources or help with a merger, that some sort of phasing in would feel like something that both solves a industrial structure problem as well as a resolution problem.
And I want to add to that, that I don't think that's just based on size. It's activity-based, it's broker-dealers, it's international activities, it's asset management, et cetera.
I think that's right. To Sandy's point earlier, I mean, if you just look at the GSIB scores and the sizes, there are many regional banks that are larger than some of the GSIBs, and that's because a lot of what's scoring there is the complexity of the activities, the cross-border activity, and breaking into that type of activity isn't something that the regional banks can readily ramp up into. So I think that might be part of why you don't see as much movement there. But it's definitely not just size. Size is important to us in terms of just who can acquire, if you just look at it from a strategy perspective.
I'd like to give you all a brief break if we could. And let's take 5 to 7 minutes, and maybe if we can come back by around 11:20 or so, that we could start our last session here.
Okay, great. Almost everybody came back, so that's a positive. Ready to go? Okay, great. So we're on our last session of the day. We're going to be talking about CCP resolution challenges, and there are a lot of challenges in that regard, as the chairman noted up front. First, we'll hear from Associate Director Jenny Traley on Title II resolution for CCPs. And then we have our guest speaker, Sir John Cunliffe, Bank of England Deputy Governor for Financial Stability and CPMI Chair, and he will offer some remarks as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Jenny.
Thank you, John. So as mentioned a few times today, we wanted to revisit the topic of CCP resolution under Title II that we started to discuss in the last SRAC meeting in 2020. And in particular, I'd like to focus on some of the key challenges we face domestically as we think about resolving one of these institutions, and highlight some of the ongoing work that the FDIC is involved in internationally to address what are some common challenges across authorities and jurisdictions. So in this session, we would like your thoughts of the prioritization of efforts to tackle these challenges that I'll describe, along with any other insights that you may have and that you can share in addressing this complex but critical area of systemic risk. So many of you may recall that when we last met in 2020, we discussed the FDIC's objectives with respect to resolution, specifically to maintain the provision of the critical clearing functions in order to protect adverse effects on U.S. financial stability. We also gave a very high-level overview of some of those challenges, and we would like to spend our time today going into some more detail. So the first challenge that we face is a lack of resources that are available exclusively to support resolution. CCPs themselves have robust loss management waterfalls as part of their rule books, particularly with respect to managing clearing member defaults. But we need to plan for and be prepared for a situation in which these resources are significantly depleted or even exhausted by the time the FDIC is appointed as receiver. We wouldn't want a scenario where if recovery failed, resolution would also fail. So another aspect to this issue of resources is the potential for these end-of-waterfall tools to have some trade-offs, such as potentially pro-cyclical impacts to markets and participants that are already under stress in that type of tail event. So while the FDIC would have the authority to use the tools and resources within the CCP's rulebook in Title II to the extent that they are still available, their application or the availability that we would think about in that context would be weighed against the financial stability consequences. And unlike SPOE for GSIBs, which we've talked about many times already today, where we have financial resources available to absorb losses and recapitalize a firm with the purpose of allowing it to continue to perform those critical functions for the market while the resolution process is ongoing, we don't have dedicated loss absorbing resources reserved for resolution in the CCP context. Such tools have been proposed and publicly debated by legislative bodies, by regulators, academics, and practitioners, and certain jurisdictions have considered or even adopted some of these tools, such as resolution cash calls that are reserved for resolution. So the second challenge we wanted to highlight, which we've mentioned earlier in Jim's remarks in the first session, is the lack of requirement for CCPs to file resolution plans with the FDIC. So this is, again, an important contrast to the bank space where GSIBs are required to file resolution plans under Title I. And in addition to providing for the resolution of GSIBs under bankruptcy without systemic implications, the Title I planning and review process, as we've talked about, greatly informs the FDIC's resolution planning under Title II. So the Title I process includes firm engagement and capabilities testing, which then leads to refined guidance over time and builds our understanding of the individual firm's operational or options and challenges in resolution. And this has facilitated ongoing improvements in the FDIC's resolution readiness over time. And along with the benefit to the FDIC, and we touched on this a bit in the last SRAC as well, the process has also been beneficial to the firms. In particular, the capabilities that they have developed as part of the resolution planning efforts have proven useful both in business as usual and in stress. The third challenge area that we want to go over today is that the FDIC does not benefit from a direct resolution engagement with these institutions. and rather we rely on the supervisory authorities of our regulatory counterparts in the CFTC, the SEC, the Federal Reserve, and that informs our understanding of resolvability. So this dynamic, combined with the lack of Title I authority, means that the FDIC doesn't have the ability to directly remove barriers to resolution or proactively enhance the resolvability of the CCPs, such as requiring changes to rule structures, capabilities, or operations. So these challenges add to the complexity of CCP resolution, which I think is acknowledged as already a difficult problem. And so we work with our U.S. counterparts and within our existing authorities to make progress. Over the last several years, we've invested a significant amount of resources together across a number of fronts. We have worked to understand how we might improve resolvability within our existing authorities, to increase our shared understanding of the processes involved in a Title II resolution, including how we would make a determination for entry into resolution for a CCP, and how to address the FDIC's information needs. We've also worked to better understand their supervisory monitoring and actions during BAU, and to develop ex-ante frameworks and legal documents to support resolution planning. And yet more work remains. So I do want to spend a few minutes talking about some of the work that we're doing on the international front, where we're very active to further progress. So if I could ask for the next slide. So the FDIC is very involved in international standard setting bodies such as the Financial Stability Board, or FSB. We also directly engage with foreign supervisory and resolution authorities through bilateral and multilateral work streams. This work helps us develop a mutual understanding of our respective resolution frameworks, address challenges across jurisdictions, and learn from one another's best practices. When we last met, we described our involvement in the FSB's work on FMI resolution, financial market infrastructure resolution, which focuses on CCPs. The FDIC has played a key leadership role in that work since 2015, and we continue to be deeply engaged. Currently, our Acting Chairman Grunberg chairs the FSB's Resolution Steering Group, and Art Merton, the Chairman's Deputy for Financial Stability, co-chairs the Working Group on FMI Cross-Border Crisis Management. And this work has continued over these years in a number of forms. Over the course of late 2020 and 2021, the FSB led a series of joint workshops with the Committee on Payments and Market Infrastructure, CPMI, and the International Organization of Securities Commissions, IOSCO, and Basel Committee, BCBS. And these workshops focused on the systemic risks posed by CCPs, as well as the possible system-wide impacts that could occur from CCP recovery and resolution. Then in November of 2020, the FSB published guidance that laid out a framework for authorities to assess the adequacy of their financial resources to support an orderly resolution. And this guidance is meant to help jurisdictions analyze and identify potential gaps in resources and then consider means for addressing those gaps. That guidance then led to the chairs of the FSB, CPMI, and IOSCO committing to conduct further work on financial resources for both recovery and resolution. And in March of this year, there was a report that was published that was part of an effort to determine whether and what future policy work might be needed on the use, composition, and amount of resources. When that was republished, the FSB agreed to review the sufficiency of the existing toolkit for resolution specifically, and considering the need for resources reserved specifically for resolution, including their associated costs and benefits, the trade-offs that would come with those potential policy choices. And this work is currently a major focus that's led by our acting chairman as the chair of that working group of RESG. And then I also want to highlight that we work directly with foreign counterparts across several venues. The first that I'll mention connects nicely to our guest speaker that will come up next, and that's engagement on CCP resolution among principals from the Bank of England, the Fed, the SEC, the CFTC, and the FDIC. This group of 5 agencies has met several times since 2018, including in the summer of last year and in February of this year. These meetings serve as a venue for high-level engagement on these unique challenges, and they serve to guide the plans for staff-level work that are ongoing among the 5 agencies across several work streams. We also host crisis management groups for CCPs. We talked about them a little bit earlier today in the bank space. We do this jointly with the CFTC and the SEC. And these CMG meetings or groups meet annually, and we've had 2 of them since 2017. We added a 3rd in 2021. And we also participate in these meetings for foreign CCPs, which are hosted by the resolution authorities in those jurisdictions. These meetings are a valuable means to understand our shared challenges, share approaches in progress, and try to identify improved resolution options. And so with that backdrop, I want to turn to our chairman to introduce our guest speaker, who has graciously agreed to speak today and address questions.
Thank you, Jenny. That was very helpful. We wanted Jenny to sort of lay out that background and context before we turn to our guest speaker, Sir John Cunliffe. I suspect some of you may know John. He serves as the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England for financial stability. He's also chairing, as Jenny mentioned, the Committee on Payments and Market Infrastructure for the BIS. He's really been an international leader on payment system issues and has particularly focused international attention for several years now around the risks related to both the supervision and the resolution of central counterparties. I think of all the issues relating to the resolution of systemic financial institutions since the 2008 crisis, this is the one that really stands out as clearly of profound systemic consequence in which we've arguably made the least progress. There are a lot of reasons for that. Perhaps John will talk about that, but I couldn't think of anybody better to at least give us a broader perspective on what I do think is a fundamental systemic resolution risk for the FDIC and for this committee to engage in. I would note that prior to taking over his payment system responsibilities, John had also been responsible for the resolution work at the Bank of England. So John and Elke and I collaborated very closely on the cross-border working relationship on the traditional GSIB resolution issues. And in some sense, we're now continuing that on the CCP work in John's current capacity. And I would note, I mean, Jenny mentioned the US-UK working group on CCP resolution. I always envied John at those meetings because on the US side, we had the Fed, the FDIC, the SEC, and the CFTC. And on the other side was John, basically embodying all these authorities and thinking to myself, boy, his life may not be easy, but it's at least a little simpler than ours. So with that, I think John is on the line and we can ask him to offer his remarks. John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Look, thanks, Marty. First, just to check whether I'm audible and visible.
Yes, both are true.
Okay, thanks. And secondly, an apology. It's a privilege to get a chance to address this group, and I would have liked to have been there in person. But I have a meeting tomorrow morning in Basel, which will, among other things, talk about the work plan for CCPs and non-default losses and the like, and made it just impossible to be with you and to get back in time. And as it's night time in Switzerland, I'm afraid the lighting may look a little strange. So I apologise for that as well. Just a quick word about what I do. So I'm Deputy Governor for Financial Stability, but I also have responsibilities for CCPs, settlement systems and payment systems for the supervision and regulation. So I'm both kind of micro-prudential and macro-prudential in this area. And up to a few years ago, I also had responsibility for resolution. One of the reasons I gave that up to another Deputy Governor actually was because we thought it was bad practice to have the same person responsible for supervision and for resolution. I think it's good practice for those things generally to be split. So from today's perspective, I guess I'm speaking from the perspective of the FSOC, from a financial stability perspective, and the CFTC and the SEC from a CCP regulator perspective. And I'm not speaking from the perspective of the FDIC, but I can still remember resolution, and I'm still closely involved with the resolution work. As Marty said, I also chair the BIS Committee on Payment Systems and Market Infrastructures, and more importantly, the joint committee we have with IOSCO, which functions as the standard setter, the international standard setter for CCPs, and issues the PFMI, which are our version of the Basel standards for CCPs and settlement systems. So I thought I'd start today with all my hats on and then speak from different perspectives, but I'll identify where I'm talking from a UK perspective. And I apologise again in advance. I don't know how much of these issues you covered in previous discussions, so some of what I see may seem blindingly obvious, in which case talk amongst yourselves or something. But if I lose people, I'm happy to pick things up in questions. I'll set out briefly why we need effective regimes to deal with CCP failure, why CCPs are different to banks in the risks they take and how they manage them, and what the UK regime will do. And we have proposals for a new regime which are now in front of Parliament, which I hope will get parliamentary approval and we can start to implement early next year. And in doing so, I'll touch on some of the suggestions that have been made for CCP resolution. So first, why does it matter? Well, as we know, CCP's role as central nodes in the financial system have made them, if they're large enough, naturally systemic, and they protect key markets from counterparty credit risk. And we saw what a failure in that area could do during the great financial crisis. And by mandating use of CCPs for some key financial derivatives after the GFC, we've made some of them even more systemic globally. For example, 60% of credit derivatives are now, swaps are now cleared centrally as opposed to 10% before the financial crisis. 85% of interest rate contracts are cleared by CCPs, was about 40% before the financial crisis. And of course, that's just the proportions. The actual quantum has grown as these markets have expanded pretty significantly. Just as important as financial markets, we've seen the role of CCPs in commodity markets in terms of the recent stress and the role they play in enabling hedging and forward contracts. So CCPs represent a concentration of risk. I always say this, that is not some unintended consequence after the great financial crisis. I mean, the assessment at the time was that the benefits from centralization in terms of consistent and prudent margining, transparency, netting, and the mutualization of losses made central counterparty clearing preferable to a complex and what had been an opaque web of bilateral contracts with much larger gross margin flows. And that was the decision we took back in 2009. And I think it still holds. But we can't ignore the concentration of risk and the failure of a CCP and the effects that would have. And it would transmit stress quite widely throughout the financial system. And it would remove the protection against counterparty credit risk, which I think is essential for markets to operate. So we do need to find effective ways to manage a CCP failure. And because the concentration effects exist, it means actually that there are returns to concentration in being a CCP, which means many of these businesses are global and they need international standards in the same way as we need international standards, strong international standards for the resolution of globally systemic banks. However, and it's an important point, CCPs are not banks, and the design of any resolution framework, I think, needs to reflect some of the essential differences. The first and most obvious, the risks they run are very different. They don't do maturity or liquidity transformation. They don't have complex balance sheets with asset and liability structures and mismatches that need to be resolved. The two risks they face essentially are counterparty credit risk, and I'll talk about that, and operational risk of some sort of operational failure. On counterparty credit risk, I mean, this stems from the default of one or more of their members. As their function is to be the central counterparty, in other words, to stand between the two parties to a trade, they really have to ensure at all times that they have exactly offsetting contracts with the buyer and the seller. In other words, they have to maintain a match book at all times. And if one of the counterparties defaults, they need to be able to absorb the losses that will probably be necessary to restore that match book by finding contracts to offset the contracts that have been lost. Now, unlike banks, they don't hold capital really to absorb loss-absorbing capital. Rather, under their rule books, they can effectively pass losses without limit back to their clearing members. First, they do that, and I think the previous speaker mentioned the waterfall of allocation of losses. First, they do that by using the pre-positioned resources of the defaulting member, and then they start to mutualize the losses by using the pre-funded default fund to which all members contribute. And then when the pre-funded resources run out, they have the ability to make cash calls on the remaining members. And then after that, they can start to haircut the margin they owe to some of their members. And finally, they can tear up some, or if necessary, all of the contracts they have with their members. So actually, unlike banks, when it comes to default losses, CCPs can't go bankrupt. At the end of the waterfall of recovery actions, they just tear up all the contracts and effectively the clearing service disappears. And I should say that if you follow the rule book, the equity of the owners is untouched in that process. But of course, from a financial stability point of view, those clearing services are important, and tearing up of contracts removes the hedges that counterparties will be depending upon in a stress. So the CCP service needs to be kept operating, and the transmission of stress needs to be kept to a minimum. Say a quick word about non-default losses. The other main risk is operational losses, not caused by a default, fraud, could be cyber, could be investment losses. Here, CCPs generally have no powers to pass those losses on to their members. Non-default losses have to be absorbed by CCP capital, and CCP capital is generally pretty small relative to the size of their operations. For one of our big CCPs, their capital is 500 million euro. Their default fund is 10 times that. The open interest passing through the CCP notional is many, many times greater. So non-default losses could therefore wipe out the capital of a CCP and lead it to insolvency, and the result again would be the loss of the clearing service. So how should resolution address those risks? Well, the first point to make is that even though for default losses, the CCP rulebook means it can effectively wind itself up without bankruptcy, the latter stages of that waterfall process could be systemically very damaging in the allocation of losses across the wider financial system, particularly once one comes to the tearing up of contracts. And clearly, as I said earlier, core financial markets could disappear if we lose effective clearing services. And in following through those recovery actions, CCP managements have choices that they can make in how they carry out those actions. And there are some actions they can't do under their rule books, and to some extent they're tied to the sequence of actions that the rule book sets out. And the last point to make, that as they carry out those actions, it's very likely that there will be disagreements between CCP management and owners on the one hand and clearing members on the other. And we've seen cases of that with defaulting members in some instances in CCPs in the past. So my first point is it is imperative that the resolution authority can step in and take control before CCP recovery actions are exhausted. I think the earlier speaker made the point that you want to ensure that when you get to resolution, the resources or the options that are available haven't effectively been exhausted. So for us, one key issue is the resolution authority needs to be able to step in on failure or the likelihood of failure before the recovery actions have been taken too far. And the resolution authority needs to be able to use the CCP recovery tools flexibly, but where those aren't sufficient, it needs to have extra tools that it can use outside outside the rule book. And of course, it needs to understand to do this and to step in that way. It needs to understand the business of the CCP, and there needs to be a resolution plan that is agreed in advance. And resolution authorities, I think, can then take actions, most of which will be in the CCP rulebook, but they can take them with a view to the allocation of losses across the system, in taking into account financial stability considerations. And then, of course, resolution authorities will operate within a public law framework. And I think one of the points that's been made to us by the private sector is that would reduce, once the resolution authority steps in, that reduces these tensions between CCP management and owners on the one hand and members on the other. And of course, in all of this, it's important, as with other forms of resolution, that there is a robust no creditor worse off provision. And the counterfactual in this case is, I think, should be what would happen if the rule book had been followed all the way to the end of the waterfall. So the current UK regime, we've had one in place since 2013, has many of those features, but it doesn't have them all. And the legislation that's now going through Parliament, I think, will give us all of those powers to operate ex ante, to require resolution plans, to remove obstacles to resolution, to step in when we need to step in, and then it will give us in some areas some extra powers that don't exist in some of the CCP rule books, and it will enshrine that no creditor worse off provision in the way that I described it. This raises the question, though, for default losses, is do we need extra pre-funded resources, either in recovery or resolution, to supplement what already exists? And I think, Marty, this is really where your resolution group is now focusing. So seen from our perspective, there are two reasons why you might want to increase the pre-funded resources in the CCP waterfall. The first, and this is a key issue for us, is the question of incentives. Because as CCP equity is not going to be written down in the case of default losses, do CCPs really have the right incentives to risk manage properly, particularly when they're in competition, as many are internationally, with other CCPs? And a point that's raised by the private sector is whether the allocation of losses between members on the one hand and CCP owners on the other is unfair, because there's very little CCP skin in the game when the losses are mutualised. So it's for that reason that some jurisdictions, like the UK, already require CCP owners to have skin in the game. It's not equity, but it's pre-funded resources that can be called upon as mutualisation takes place, mutualisation of losses takes place in the waterfall. And the issue is how large that skin in the game should be, and at what stages of the waterfall should it be exposed to loss. The UK regime that's now being legislated will give us the power to call for a second skin in the game tranche, which we could insert at a later point in the waterfall. But the key point here, I think, and the size of that is something we have yet to determine. But the key point here, to be clear, the objective is to ensure that the incentives are sufficient and rightly placed to avoid resolution by incentivising CCP management. It's not really a question of ensuring that pre-funded resources are available in resolution. So that's the second reason you might want to increase pre-funded resources, to ensure that you have enough in resolution and that you don't want to rely on cash calls, haircutting of variation margin, or in the later stages, tear up once the resolution authority comes in. So one option, which has been much discussed and papers written about this, would be for CCP to raise extra resources by issuing bail-in bonds in the way that banks do, and then those bonds could be written down in resolution and the funds used to absorb losses. So a number of reasons have been given as to why that might be preferable to depending on cash calls and cutting of margin and other tools. One is whether cash calls will be too pro-cyclical in the event of a CCP stress, and it would be better to have the resources pre-positioned, and the other is that whether cash calls would actually be effective, because clearing members might well, under stress, resist further cash calls. And this is a kind of complex debate, and I think it's going to be where Chairman Gruenberg's international group go next. But I thought I'd offer a few thoughts on this, and it's informed in part by the first stage of the international work, which looked at the sufficiency of pre-funded and non-pre-funded resources in a number of systemic CCPs, the ability to absorb losses in recovery and resolution. And I think that work was published early in the year. And the work suggested that these systemic CCPs could absorb failure of up to 4 of their largest clearing members. And the international standard is 2 large clearing members, but they could absorb failure up to the 4 largest clearing members, although some would exhaust pre-funded resources and need to go into cash calls at that point. But the cash calls that would be necessary would be within the capacity of the remaining clearing members, which tend to be the larger financial institutions. And on the question of whether firms will be able to resist cash calls, I'd only observe that if you resist a cash call, you're effectively in default, and that triggers other default cross clauses. So I think it's unlikely that clearing members would try to resist contributing to cash calls. But there's a big caveat in all of this, which is in a stretch in which, say, 3 to 4 of the biggest clearing members fail, we may find that actually those liquidity resources aren't available for the other clearing members, and this could make the stress more stressful. The only point I'd make, though, is if we're in a stress in which 3 to 4 of the big clearing members fail, and remember that's not just in one CCP, that's across the board and across the financial system. And if the resolution, so we're talking about potentially the failure of, say, 2 to 4 GSIBs, and then the resolution arrangements for those GSIBs has also failed because resolution would enable them to continue to meet their obligations to a CCP without default. I think we're going to be in a pretty heavy systemic crisis, and bail-in bonds and the resources that they might offer, even if it's a full reload of the default fund, may help, but they're unlikely to be able to resolve the systemic issues that we face. And those considerations, I think, need to be balanced quite carefully. In the end, it's a question of how far into the tail of the risk distribution you want to go with protection, and does the extra bang that you get by, say, bail-in bonds, is it proportionate, and do the costs outweigh the benefits? And I'd say that there are costs for which we need to recognise. I mean, just a simple thought experiment back of the envelope. If a CCP issued bonds equal to the default fund, so it would have a full reload in resolution, the annual coupon of that could be equal to or greater than CCP capital, and those costs, of course, are likely to get passed back to users, raising the costs and reducing the incentives to clear. So one needs to think about what benefit in that sort of systemic stress you would get from this against the costs and the disincentives to clear in business as usual. Of course, jurisdictions are different, and there could be jurisdictional reasons why one might want to go at least some distance down that route. I mean, in a world where the resolution authority either doesn't have the line of sight or can't effectively or quickly step in before the resources that are available in recovery are exhausted, or where the resolution authority is not able to plan for CCP resolution and sort of comes in and has to deal with a very complex situation without there being a plan or sufficient advanced knowledge, or where CCP rulebooks are either they don't provide sufficient options, or actually there are obstacles to resolution there which can't be cleared away. In those circumstances, one might argue, well, a reservoir of pre-funded resources that can be accessed only in resolution might be necessary to enable the CCP clearing service to continue to operate. And the next stage of the FSB work, I hope, will look at these issues and maybe tease them apart and give us a better line of sight. And finally, and I'll stop very shortly, I should say a word about non-default losses, because in a way, these are equally, if not more worrying, because the position is very different and the CCP recovery actions are very limited, and the capital to absorb these losses is pretty limited as well. So the resolution authority in that case will not be able to depend on the waterfall. It will need to have access to some other resources. So in the UK, the new powers that we hope will be approved by Parliament will give us the power to make a cash call. We're thinking of something, the proposal we put out there is 3 times the default fund to cope or to absorb the losses of non-default losses and to recapitalise the CCP. And of course, in those circumstances, there is no creditor worse option, protection that protects the equity. And so the equity of the CCP would be wiped out. We need to think about what then happened to ownership and whether the CCP was passed back to the members. But we feel it very important in the UK that as a resolution authority, we have access to resources to deal with non-default losses. Now, that bail-in bonds could be a reason to do that as well. But as I say, the cost of holding them is high. And of course, if it's an idiosyncratic failure of a CCP because of fraud or cyber, then we won't be in a systemic crisis. And those cash calls wouldn't have that pro-cyclical effect. But again, that's how you deal with non-default losses as a resolution authority needs to be worked out. But I think it's very important the resolution authority has access to some resources to meet that and to be able to keep the clearing service in operation. And the last point I'd make, and this is something that will come up at my meetings tomorrow, of course, the CPMI OSCO standards are for the operation of CCPs. They don't include resolution. We're kind of, we deal with life and the resolution authorities deal with death, if I could put it that way. But I think we need to think about, in recovery, should CCPs have better options to deal with non-default losses, and that's work that I hope will be starting in the near future. I'll stop there. Marty, thank you.
John, thank you very much for that, I must say, exceptionally lucid presentation on a pretty complicated subject. And John's agreed to take a few questions from the committee if there are any members that would like to follow up with him. Yes, Dick Herring from the University of Pennsylvania for John's benefit.
Thank you. That was a terrific overview. You didn't mention one of the differences from a bank resolution that strikes me as very important in this case. In a bank resolution, we can hope at least to have a resolution weekend. It strikes me that with a CCP, you have almost no time to intervene and try to take control of the situation, keep it from deteriorating quickly. How do you deal with that much shorter time for action?
I think you may be on mute.
I've been unmuted, I'm sorry. Look, that's a real challenge. And in the circumstances which this is happening, and say 2 clearing members, the largest 2 clearing members have defaulted, prices will be moving very fast in markets. So you'll be in a situation of general stress. I mean, to my mind, it makes the case for the resolution authority to be closely involved with the business of the CCP, for there to be close cooperation between the CCP supervisors and the CCP resolution authority. It's easy for me to say that because in the Bank of England we look at these things in an integrated way, but also the resolution plan has got to have fast stabilisation. That said, some of the defaults we've seen in the past, CCPs have been able to go through that default waterfall quite quickly. I'm thinking of Lehman Brothers. So the Lehman Brothers default, there were large positions held, certainly at the London Clearing House, and those positions were closed. They were auctioned off, the losses absorbed. In the middle of a global stress, if you remember, the losses absorbed and people paid out very quickly, whereas the non-centrally cleared contracts took years to work out in a bankruptcy. But look, it is a challenge. I think what we'll do in the UK, also is we will do some dry runs and some kind of resolution testing. I think though, once the resolution authority steps in, we haven't had to do a big resolution in the UK, I'm pleased to say, but once the resolution authority steps in and says, look, we are now in charge, we're taking over control of the rule book and the actions, I think that might also have a stabilising effect. But ex-ante planning, wargaming, knowing where your tools are and the risks, I think will be essential. But it will be quite a stress period if we have to do it.
Thank you. Wilson Irvin.
Thanks, John. I agree. This was a terrific presentation on a tough subject. We've recently gone through a period in a few markets where interest rates were quite shocked and went outside some of the initial margins that people had been thinking about. I am wondering if we're thinking about different types of events where we might want to protect, could minimum initial margins, some sort of constraints on that be another solution if we're thinking about different types of waterfalls that could internalize more of these to the stressed members and take some of the pressure out of this? Second question I had is, if you're not wiping out equity in some of these cases, how do you align the incentives of the CCP towards systemically positive events? If it's really not coming out of their pockets, how do you improve that alignment going forward?
Yeah. So look, on the first, I think, and I'm doing work with IOSCO, co-chairing a group with Russ Benham of the CFTC on what we saw in the dash for cash in 2020 and actually what we've seen in commodity markets. I should say, by the way, if that was a polite reference to the little local difficulty we had in long gilts in the UK a couple of weeks ago, those were all bilaterally margined. So we didn't actually, there was no CCP impact. The impact was taken by the banks that were providing the repo basically and margining bilaterally. But more generally, I think we do need to look at the responsiveness of CCP margin to shocks. And I mean, this goes under the unlovely name of, do you need mechanisms for anti-pro-cyclicality? But in other words, should we be calling margin more prudently in good times or normal times so that the jump to stress margin is not so great in bad times? And we will be looking at that work. We published a report from that group which looked at the dash for cash, and I'm hoping we can look at that internationally. There'll be some actions to look at the responsiveness of CCP margin models, because ideally, as with banks, or more than ideally, you don't want to be in a resolution situation to begin with, and the protection against default losses is the initial margin that the defaulter has to pay in advance, and then the sizing of the default fund. And I hope out of that will come some views on how to measure pro-cyclicality of margin in stress, which is what would cause the default. The margin would go up, you assume, and the clearing member would not be able to pay it. And do we need to, I think you called it minimum margin, but do we need to be calling a bit more margin in normal times, a bit over prudently, in order to avoid a big jump under stress? Some jurisdictions already within the UK and Europe have, I'd use the word, anti-pro-cyclicality measures. They weren't. We learned some lessons in the dash for cash about how effective they are, but I think that is an issue, and it's one answer. The other answer to avoid you getting to resolution is exactly as you say: how do you ensure the incentives are aligned? The problem with equity, and this is something I think the FSB wrestled with when it put out its first set of guidance some years ago, is that if you have a no creditor worse off protection, and if the rule book basically says the CCP can call on make unlimited calls on its members, and in the end wind itself up and still preserve the equity, you can't square that with writing down the equity in resolution with the no creditor worse off guarantee. I think that's something that needs to be looked at again, actually, and we need to think about whether the no creditor worse off guarantee should offer that level of protection to shareholders in terms of incentives. But skin in the game, so resources which are not equity, don't go to the ownership, but which belong to the CCP owners and which are exposed either initially when mutualization happens, or initially and then as you dig deeper into the waterfall, that's one way of, if you like, creating the incentive that writing down the equity would give you without having to wrestle with this no creditor worse off protection, which is important in resolution because we are disturbing people's legal property rights and they do need to be protected. But I think incentives are a big part of it. And certainly in my jurisdiction, we're going to be looking at skin in the game and whether that is in the right place.
Good. Yes, Andy?
John, thanks so much. A few just sort of follow-ons. You talked a little bit about the non-default losses and having the resolution authority have the ability to cash call. Again, just how are you thinking through? Because you clearly know that that's the risks that are occurring are solely brought on board by the CCP management itself. And I should say we're talking about demutualized, not mutualized CCPs. But they make the choices on where to place their investments, where to place that collateral, and how much they spend on their cyber resilience. So having the backstop of doing a cash call of the clearing members, which have no engagement in that risk management, but provide a pocket, well, I understand that can stabilize. That's just such a disconnect. How can that be a good long-term approach? And maybe you're saying that's why we want to look for better tools to really aligning incentives to appropriate risk management. I think that would be the first question I have. So, and I have another one if I could, Chairman.
Let me do that one. Shall I do that one? Because I'll forget. Forget it if you ask another
Me
one.
too. It's all good.
Yeah. So look, I mean, non-default losses strike me as a really big problem. We already have actually in the UK that you can mutualize the investment losses. Where they put their money, where they put the margin, where they lose that. So we already have that in the UK regime, but we'll extend it. I think you're in the worlds of second best here. Bear in mind that however you fund that, whether it's pre-funded resources or whether it's a cash call, we have a clearing obligation, a clearing mandate on many of these services. Those costs are going to be passed back to users. So it's not a question that there is some way that users can avoid the costs. I mean, if you say and of course with non-default losses, it's very difficult to size them, particularly something like a cyber attack. But if we said, like the bill the idea that I think has been talked about in the UK, that it's a multiple of the default fund, the carry cost of that is pretty large, and it's passed back to the members. And of course, these are resources that are not doing anything because they're just sitting there, kind of waiting to be used, which is the difference, I think, with banks to some extent. So, in that world of second best, I think you want to do two things. Non-default losses would wipe out CCP equity. There's no creditor worse off protection there because under current rule books, that's what would happen. So the incentive has to come from the wipeout of the equity, which you think would take have some incentive effect, and then I think members will be members need the clearing service, and we need the clearing service to continue. And the choice then is, because these are mutual animals, you go back to the members, or whether the public sector steps in. And I think public sector support for CCPs is something we all want to avoid for pretty obvious reasons. I'd say one last thing, which is, as with bank resolution, in the situation where a CCP's capital is wiped out by the members and then the losses are absorbed by the cash call and the CCP is recapitalized by the cash call, then in those situations, the members would then own the clearing service. I mean, they might not want to, but that's pretty much the same as in bank resolution. But I don't think there's an easy answer to this. One better answer to this, I think, might be for CCPs to have better recovery options, and also to think about how with their members they manage these risks. As a general view, I think the more you put expose members to these risks, the more they will demand, I think, more involvement in risk management and to understand what is being spent on CCPs. And maybe that comes to something around the governance of CCPs and the governance of their risk management. their risk management machinery. Just one last point on that, which I get told off for saying it, but I'll say it anyway. When you talk to the CCPs, they tell us that the pressure they get from their members is to charge less margin, to reduce the cost of trading all the time. And the like. When you talk to the clearing members at very senior levels, they say they're worried about the risks in CCPs and the fact that they are exposed to these risks, both the mutualised default and the non-default, and they don't have kind of enough influence on the CCPs. I think some of the answers to this lie in the clearing members, and actually whether the risk control impulse in the clearing member outweighs the "can I do this trade as cheaply as possible" impulse in the clearing member. So there are some issues there, I think, for clearing members as well. Sorry, you had a second question.
Yeah, I think just a couple things. I think on the governance, I think you nailed it there. And I think, if you see many of the writings and, the acting chairman mentioned them by both buy side and sell side, I think there's just a very clear drive by global industry, and I'm no longer in it anymore, to actually build upfront resources because you want them to be predictable, manageable, and understood. Yet it seems really hard to get there. And I'm just curious as to your viewpoint, because it seems like, our regulators are aligned, our academics are aligned, the industry wants something, yet we are not there yet. And I think upfront is the way to go, and inclusive of bail-inable debt, except I would just offer, rather than shock absorbency, that's really a recapitalization mechanism, right? Because then it moves from a demutualized to a mutualized model, which is probably a more appropriate model, but that's just not where we are at the moment. So I guess my question is, why are we collectively having a hard time if everyone says they want more pre-funded, they want TLAC, they want better collateral, they want more appropriate through the cycle margins? So I'd love your view because I certainly can't figure it out.
So first of all, I think to the extent that CCPs compete on margin, and they shouldn't, so I don't know if they do or not, but the extent they do, that's because they're under commercial pressure from their clearing members. And when you talk to them, particularly for clearing services that are contested between different CCPs, we certainly get an awful lot of reports that they are basically under pressure because their clearing members will go to the cheapest option. And of course, pre-funded resources cost money, but there are other things that cost money in terms of margining as well. So I'm not sure it's quite as one-sided as one thinks. And of course, the cost of bail-in bonds, as I say, so I think the default fund of the London Clearing House is around 10 billion. I don't know what the coupon will be on a bail-in bond, but that cost, particularly where there's a clearing mandate and you're legally obliged to use a CCP, and I don't think any of us want to get into the economic regulation of CCPs, but maybe one will have to go there one day. Those costs are going to come back to members as well. So I don't see this as such a one-sided set of issues, to be honest. I think there is a really big issue about transparency, and this comes down to margin models. And one of the recommendations of the CPMI OSCO group that I mentioned was that there should be much more transparency around margin models and their procyclicality, how they will react in stress, so that clearing members can see that and plan for it, but also metrics, so that clearing members can have a view on whether they want to use CCPs with more procyclical models or less procyclical models. Some of it will depend on the nature of the clearing service, because clearly a great difference between clearing agricultural futures on the one hand and interest rate derivatives on the other. But I think transparency is a big issue here. But I think also we need to think, individual regulators need to think about whether I'd call it pre-funded or whether I'd call it just the way those margin models are tuned between pre-stress and stress. I think there's a conversation to have there as well. But I mean, I guess my point is, in the end, some of the pressures on CCPs come from their members. And I think it would help if members looked at the seniority and the background of the people they appoint to the risk committees.
Yeah, I think you're right about that, and I would suggest too that where clearing members raise certain issues that are related to risk, whether it's margin or collateral or things of that nature, there's a way that those that oversee the CCPs have insight to that, because I think there's a gap between what the clearing members may weigh as a viewpoint and whether or not that gets, taken on board. Reference, and Don and I wrote a little bit about this in the Task Force on Financial Stability in, December 2017, when Bitcoin went on to CME, for example, and got the part of the waterfall in the default fund.
Yeah, it's not
That's interesting, not standardized, et cetera. So I just think we need to create some transparency there so that, the regulators can be actually helpful in understanding the risks that are coming on board.
I think that's right, but I think the regulators also need the powers to be able to take those decisions. And different jurisdictions regulators have different powers for the approval or not of new clearing products. But some of this goes, I think, to regulatory and supervisory powers. And it's not just in new products. And there is also actually part of the legislation I was talking about. Will give the Bank of England rulemaking power in this area, which we haven't had in the past because it was all done in Europe. So there's some, we hope to have more options, I think, in the future.
Good. Are there any other questions for John? John, thank you. This has been a superb, really, overview of an important issue, and we want to elevate attention to it. So this will be an ongoing issue and matter of attention for the FDIC, and we'll bring it back to this committee as well. So thanks a lot.
Okay, look, thank you for the invitation. And should I say, Marty, also thank you for taking on the international work, because these are basically global infrastructures, and we need to manage this at the international level.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll see you.
Okay.
Bye-bye. All right. Well, yeah, John.
It was interesting, the contrast between the Bank of England. I got the sense from our earlier discussion that most of the progress we've been making here is procedural. We've got a lot of people talking together and building understanding that we didn't have before. But substantively, where do we stand here in the United States if one of these units were to get into serious trouble? Do we have the capability to deal in a timely way?
I'll be glad to respond, but I'll give Jenny first crack.
Sure. So I mean, we've highlighted a number of the challenges today, including that the runway is likely to be short. So I think that we look at the existing planning that we have, our existing authorities and tools. We talk a lot about the procedure of the way we work with the supervisors and the other authorities, because that's how we build our understanding and our information. And so we do look at individual firms and we do build on that planning. But we acknowledge that there are challenges and there's more work to be done there. Data, I mean, there's a lot of things that we've highlighted. I think ultimately the strategy for a CCP resolution isn't that much different than what we would attempt to achieve for other institutions, in that you're trying to preserve those critical operations for the market. And so if there was we would look to move those critical operations into a bridge institution. And so the work then goes into how do you operationalize that? But the strategy isn't so much different. It's just all the sort of the unknowns and the information that we need.
If I can comment, and it really goes to the broader issue that was raised earlier about the gap on the resolution side relating to non-bank financial companies, of which CCPs are, in some sense, the ultimate example of a systemic non-bank financial company. And the fact is, this is my perspective on it, that the Dodd-Frank Act really put in place a coherent framework of authorities for the agencies to deal with the resolution of a global systemic banking organization. We really have the Title II authorities with the Orderly Liquidation Fund backstop, complemented by the Title I resolution plans, which gives us both a line of sight into the companies and authorities to get the firms to make organizational and operational changes to enhance their resolvability. And we got domestically and internationally a agreement on a requirement for TLAC additional loss absorbing resources to facilitate the resolution of the firm, so that we really have and we've made enormous progress, if I may say, in terms of cross-border cooperation with the key jurisdictions represented by Elke's presence here and John's participation in this meeting, so that we've really built what I would consider to be a fairly credible framework, which hasn't been tested yet in practice. We have not yet executed it. So I have that caveat that until we do it, I'd be a little cautious, about what representations we make. But I think we have a set of authorities, capabilities, resources that did not exist across international relationships, that simply didn't exist prior to 2008. That puts us in I believe, in a very different place, and that I happen to believe we could execute if it were required of us. I think in the non-bank financial company sector and the CCPs are the prime illustration of this. We don't have that coherent framework. And I should mention the Supervision Authority that we talked about earlier, that where we as the banking agency have a supervisory role and line of sight into these firms. On the non-bank side, and CCPs are a good illustration, we have, by default, Title II would be the public authority for a systemic firm failure, whether it's a bank or non-bank, and we could bring those authorities to bear. But the supervision responsibilities are in the market regulators, and we do not have a resolution planning requirement. And we're talking about internationally additional resources, loss absorbing resources and resolution, but don't have something in place. So we don't have the framework on the non-bank side, including the CCPs that we've built on the banking side. We have the benefit of now having a framework and an example to learn from and apply, but frankly, we have a lot of work to do in the United States with our counterpart agencies to try to, as best we can, the Fed, the SEC, the CFTC, to try to collaborate in the absence of additional statutory authority, as well as on the international side to try to build stronger cross-border relationships. But the question is a fair one. We don't have the framework, the infrastructure in place on the non-bank side. And that's why this is on the agenda for today's meeting, because I think looking at the post-crisis world, this is probably where our attention and priority needs to be.
James. Yeah, all I can say is I agree with you. Back in my old seat, both of these conversations that we've had today are related. Who are the members of the CCPs? They're the entities that we're looking at from, and I knew that if it's a broker dealer, you would be calling me, telling me, make sure they make good on their obligations to the CCP, because they have to be related, right? You can't look at CCP resolution in isolation from resolution of financial, because they're going to happen at the same time.
Right, and the great news is in most of the financial institution, I think in all of the financial institution resolution recovery plans, their exposures to the CCP are in there. right? And their largest counterparty exposures are in there. Where I think the model becomes less stable from the centralized approach is these uncapped cash calls, these potential contract tear-ups, which is basically taking the CCP out of the space of being a CCP and opening up exposures that people can't manage. And just to follow that thought through, if you're a clearing member, you're not allowed to operate out of a CCP. If you're an end user, you can go, but who you're going to trade with, because there's no market depth. So these are, again, if they're predictable, manageable, it can be done. Those pieces need to be closed down. And the last bit I think we should carry on thinking about is who has some of these extraordinary tools, who can enact them, like variation margin haircutting, for those who may not be as familiar with it, and I'm sorry to say I am as familiar with it as I am, that would be the equivalent of in a bank resolution resolution plan saying, we are just going to haircut your deposit in order to survive. That wouldn't exist anywhere else. So if we're going to think like that, who does that and for how much? Because that might be perfectly good in recovery for a recovery and resolution authority to do. But I would question that in the hands of the management of the CCP that has taken it into this place. And again, the demutualized model, not the mutualized model. So I think that's where the work needs to be done. And the reason hair is not on fire is because we do have a lot more strength in our CCPs. There is margin. We saw the results of the recent report that came out at 4 times coverage and 1.4 times scale up, right? Those are good things, but we need to sort it out, it seems to me. So really, please keep doing this really important work so we can finish taking it to the hoop.
Thank you. Anything else for today? Well, thank you all. This has been a very helpful discussion, and we appreciate you all taking part, and we'll do it again next year. Thank you. And we'll have lunch upstairs.